lives that begin quietly, far from the noise of greatness, and yet grow into stories that reshape the world. Tonight, I want to tell you about a boy from a small coastal town. A boy who listened more than he spoke, who watched the movement of stars and the habits of plants, who carried questions the way others carried tools. His name was Aristotle. He began as a student in the shadow of a great teacher and in time became the voice that guided kings. Before we begin, if calm, thoughtful stories like this bring you comfort, feel free to subscribe and leave a like. It helps these quiet histories find the people who need them. This is the gentle story of how a curious child became a seeker of truth, a wanderer of ideas, and eventually the man who shaped the mind of Alexander the Great. It is not a story of battles or empires, but of observation, patience, and the slow unfolding of wisdom. Settle in, breathe softly, and let the night open around you. Aristotle's story begins not in a grand city of marble columns or bustling marketplaces, but in the quiet coastal town of Stagira, a place where the air carried the gentle scent of sea salt and wild thyme, and where the hills rose softly from the shoreline like old guardians watching over the Aegean. It was a town small enough for every face to be familiar, for every footstep on its narrow paths to echo with the rhythm of daily life. Here, houses were simple, built of stone and wood, their walls warmed each morning by sunlight that crept over the hills in long, gentle strokes. In the early hours, fishermen returned from the sea with nets heavy from the night's labor, their voices low and steady as they spoke of tides and winds. Farmers moved slowly through their fields, tending to the earth that fed their families, and children wandered barefoot along the dusty roads, chasing shadows and insects with the unhurried curiosity of youth. It was in this quiet world, shaped more by nature than by politics or philosophy, that Aristotle spent his earliest years, absorbing without effort the subtle patterns of life that would one day shape his mind. His father, Nicomachus, served as a physician, a role that placed him at the boundary between the mysteries of the human body and the practical realities of healing. In their home, jars of herbs lined the shelves, each with its own scent and purpose. Lavender for calming the spirit, willow bark for easing pain, mint for cleansing the breath. The young Aristotle grew up watching his father grind roots into powder, mix tinctures, examine patients with steady hands and thoughtful eyes. From these early observations, he learned that the world was not governed by chaos, but by patterns. Patterns hidden beneath skin, behind symptoms, within the rhythms of illness and recovery. Even as a child, he sensed that everything had a cause, that every question, if followed far enough, led to another question waiting quietly in the shadows. Though he did not yet understand the full weight of this realization, the seeds of inquiry were already being planted within him, their roots threading slowly through the soft soil of his imagination. His mother, Phaestis, was known for a gentleness that matched the landscape of Stagira itself. She taught Aristotle the slower lessons of life, how to notice the change in a person's face when they were troubled, how to read the sky for signs of approaching weather, how to appreciate the quiet beauty of a task done carefully and with attention. She was not a philosopher nor a scholar, but her way of moving through the world, patient, observant, steady, left a mark on Aristotle that influenced him far more deeply than grand speeches or scholarly debates might have. From her, he learned the value of humility, of listening before speaking, of letting silence reveal truths that words sometimes concealed. These lessons would shape him just as profoundly as anything he encountered in the academy years later. The world outside his home provided its own education. Stagira was surrounded by hills rich with plant life, forests where sunlight filtered through the leaves in soft green waves, and rocky shores where small creatures lived among the tide pools. Aristotle spent long hours wandering through these landscapes, crouching beside unfamiliar plants to study the shape of their leaves, watching how insects worked tirelessly in the dirt, tracing the patterns made by birds as they moved across the sky. He noticed how each creature seemed to fit perfectly within its surroundings, as though nature itself held a quiet order that invited understanding. These early wanderings did not yet resemble scientific study, but they awakened in him a sense of reverence for the natural world, a feeling that stayed with him even when life took him far from the gentle slopes of his childhood home. Despite the tranquility of Stagira, Aristotle's childhood was not untouched by sorrow. Both of his parents died while he was still young, leaving him in the care of relatives who tried to offer stability but could not replace the soft, grounding presence he had lost. Grief entered his life, not as a crushing force, but as a quiet, persistent shadow, a reminder of impermanence, of the fragile thread connecting each life to the world. This early encounter with loss deepened his introspection. It taught him to look beyond the surface of things, to wonder about the nature of the soul, of change, of growth and decay. While other children chased games through the streets, Aristotle often found himself drawn inward, contemplating questions he could not yet articulate. The loneliness of these early years formed a space within him, a space where curiosity could take root, where questions could echo without interruption, where the early seeds of philosophy could germinate patiently over time. Stagira itself, though small, offered Aristotle glimpses of the wider world. Travelers passed through its modest harbour, bringing stories of distant lands, of the grand temples of Athens, of the bustling markets of Corinth, of the mysterious philosophies discussed beneath foreign colonnades. These tales stirred something restless within him, a quiet longing to see the world beyond the familiar hills and gentle waves. As he grew older, this longing sharpened into a sense of destiny, not one marked by ambition, but by the steady pull of a mind hungry for knowledge. He sensed, in a way he could not yet voice, that his life was meant to unfold far beyond the borders of Stagira, that the questions forming silently within him would one day lead him into places where they could be nurtured, challenged, refined. Yet even as he dreamed of distant cities, Aristotle remained deeply connected to the land that had shaped him. The quiet mornings by the sea, the soft glow of oil lamps in his childhood home, the smell of herbs crushed beneath his father's hands. These memories became the foundation upon which all his later learning would rest. The simplicity of Stagira taught him to see beauty in the ordinary, to value careful observation over grand declarations, to trust that truth often revealed itself not through noise, but through patient attention. These early experiences would inform his later work, the detailed classifications of plants and animals, the careful study of causes, the belief that understanding begins with noticing the world as it is before imagining how it could be. And so, in this small coastal town, far from the centers of power and thought, the boy who would one day teach kings learned his first and most enduring lessons, not from scrolls or scholars, but from the rhythm of nature, the compassion of his parents, the quiet persistence of grief, and the gentle unfolding of curiosity. Stagira shaped him in ways he would spend a lifetime exploring, its memory a steady heartbeat beneath the vast architecture of his later achievements. From his earliest years, Aristotle seemed to move through the world with a kind of inward tilt, as though each sight, each sound, each small shift in the air carried with it a question quietly waiting to be uncovered. Other children in Stagira ran along the shoreline shouting and laughing as the waves chased their ankles. But Aristotle often lingered behind, crouching near the tide pools with his hands resting lightly on the stones. He watched how the small creatures within them moved, how some darted like tiny flickers of light, while others recoiled into their shells with slow, deliberate caution. He traced the shape of seaweed caught between rocks, noticing how its color changed depending on the angle of the sun, and he studied the patterns left in the sand by the retreating water. To anyone else, these were the ordinary details of the shoreline, but to Aristotle they felt like clues to a deeper order, hints of a structure beneath the surface of things. He sensed, even before he could express it, that the world followed laws that waited patiently to be understood. In the fields outside town, where stalks of grain whispered in the wind and insects hummed steadily through the warm afternoons, Aristotle found another kind of classroom. He would lie on his back, hands folded across his chest, watching the slow drift of clouds across the sky. He noticed how some clouds moved with a sharp, determined edge, while others dissolved into soft, feathery shapes. He wondered why storms gathered in some seasons and not others, why certain winds carried the smell of rain, why the light became golden at certain hours of the day. His mind never accepted these changes as simple facts. Instead, it tugged gently at them, searching for causes, connections, and reasons. Even before he knew the word philosophy, the practice of questioning lived within him like a quiet flame. Inside the home his father had once filled with the scents of herbs and polished bronze instruments, Aristotle found himself drawn to the tools of healing. After Nicomachus's death, the instruments remained: small knives with curved blades, delicate probes made for examining wounds, jars filled with dried plants whose colors softened with time. Aristotle would sit near them, touching each object with the reverence one gives to something both familiar and mysterious. He wondered why certain herbs soothed pain while others soothed fear, why some wounds healed cleanly while others festered despite careful tending. He felt as though every answer opened another door in his mind, revealing more questions waiting beyond. These early experiences with medicine shaped one of the deepest aspects of his character: the conviction that understanding the world required looking closely, patiently, without turning away from complexity. The adults in Stagira sometimes viewed the boy with a quiet amusement. They saw him pausing in the middle of chores to stare at the flight of a bird, or asking questions that felt too large for someone his age. Questions about the nature of the soul, about why living things grew and changed, about whether the stars were made of the same material as the earth beneath their feet. They answered as best as they could, but Aristotle rarely seemed satisfied with simple explanations. It was not that he distrusted the adults. Rather, he sensed that many of their answers were shaped by tradition rather than observation. Even at a young age, he felt drawn toward the idea that truth required careful attention, not just acceptance. The people of Stagira would smile, shake their heads gently, and whisper to one another that the boy's mind was restless, perhaps even too hungry for a place as quiet as their own. Though he was frequently lost in thought, Aristotle was not an aloof or distant child. He felt deeply the emotions of others, and he was quick to notice when someone was troubled. He observed how worry settled into the lines of a person's face, how joy softened their posture, how grief made their movements slower and more hesitant. As he watched these subtle changes, he began to ask questions about the human heart, why people reacted differently to the same events, why some found courage in difficulty while others found fear, why anger sometimes erupted suddenly and sometimes dissolved without a trace. These observations created within him a curiosity not only about nature and the physical world, but about human behavior, the inner patterns that guided people often without their awareness. This early fascination with the human condition would one day become a cornerstone of his philosophical work, giving rise to inquiries into ethics, psychology, and the structure of society. At night, when the faint breeze carried the smell of the sea into the house and the oil lamp cast long shadows across the walls, Aristotle often lay awake, turning over questions in his mind. He wondered whether objects fell to the ground for reasons beyond their weight, whether the stars kept their places in the sky by some hidden force, whether living beings shared a common essence that tied them to one another. The quiet darkness of the room seemed to expand around him, offering a space where questions could float freely. These moments, alone with his thoughts, undisturbed by the noise of the world, became some of the earliest foundations of his intellectual life. He felt no urgency to find answers quickly. Instead, he savored the slow unfolding of curiosity, the gentle process of letting a question deepen over time. The people of Stagira, though not scholars, noticed something unusual in him. There were moments when he stood by himself at the edge of town, looking out toward the distant horizon where the sky met the sea, with a look of longing that seemed strange for a child so young. Some whispered that he was destined for a life beyond their quiet village, that his mind would not be satisfied with the smallness of their world. They saw in him a reflective stillness, a seriousness that did not dampen his kindness but set him apart from other children. While the others played in the streets until dusk, Aristotle often wandered toward the hills, as though the landscape itself called to him with questions waiting to be heard. What drew him most deeply, however, was not the desire to escape Stagira, but the desire to understand. He felt that every living thing carried within it a secret waiting to be discovered, that the world was layered with meanings that could be revealed through patient thought and attentive observation. These early realizations shaped the essence of who he would become, a thinker who believed that knowledge begins with the senses, that the act of looking closely at the world is the first step toward wisdom. Thus, long before he traveled to Athens, before he studied under Plato, before he taught kings and shaped the course of Western thought, Aristotle was simply a boy standing on the shores of Stagira, driven by a quiet hunger to understand the world around him. His questions were small at first, like tiny seeds scattered in the soil of his young mind. But as he grew, so did the questions, taking root, branching outward, forming the beginnings of a lifelong pursuit that would carry him far beyond the gentle hills of his childhood home. Aristotle's departure from Stagira came quietly, without the kind of ceremony that accompanies the beginning of a life destined for greatness. He left, as many young men did, with a small bundle of belongings, a few coins, and a heart filled with equal parts hope and uncertainty. Yet beneath that simplicity lay something deeper, a feeling that the path before him was not merely a journey of distance, but a journey toward a world where his questions might finally find a place to grow. Athens, the city whispered about by travelers and admired from afar, called to him like a distant star. It was said to be a place where ideas lived openly, where thinkers gathered beneath marble columns to debate the nature of reality, where poets recited verses under the soft glow of lamplight, and where the mind could stretch itself without fear of ridicule. For a young man shaped by curiosity, the promise of such a city felt like a quiet awakening waiting just beyond the horizon. The journey itself was long, winding along dusty inland roads and narrow coastal paths where the sound of the sea never quite faded. Aristotle walked much of the way, feeling the weight of the landscape shift around him, the rugged hills giving way to open plains, the quiet of small towns replaced gradually by the busier rhythms of more populated regions. Each night, as he rested beneath the open sky or in the sheltered corners of modest inns, he allowed himself to imagine what Athens might be like. He pictured vast libraries filled with scrolls that contained thoughts older than his grandparents, gatherings of scholars discussing ideas with passion, and quiet corners where he might sit with a tablet and stylus, letting his thoughts unravel into words. The anticipation settled into him softly, like the warmth of an evening fire after a long day's walk. As he drew closer to the city, the landscape began to bear the marks of civilization more boldly. Roads widened, travelers became more numerous, distant villas appeared on the hillsides, their white walls catching the sun like small beacons. He encountered groups of merchants carrying goods, young men in training headed toward athletic competitions, and older philosophers making the journey back from surrounding towns. Aristotle listened to their conversations as they walked, fascinated by the ease with which they spoke of politics, poetry, and philosophy, topics rarely discussed with such depth in Stagira. Each overheard fragment stirred a quiet excitement within him. He felt as though he were walking toward a place where minds breathed differently, where thought itself carried a unique texture and weight. At last, after days that blurred into one another like waves merging on the shoreline, Aristotle crested a hill and caught his first glimpse of Athens. The city rose from the landscape in soft layers of stone and sunlit marble, its buildings arranged with a beauty that felt both intentional and natural. The Acropolis stood proudly above the city, illuminated by the afternoon sun, its temples gleaming like the bones of ancient giants. Below it stretched a tapestry of roofs, streets, and courtyards, each humming with the life of a city whose reputation had reached even the quiet corners of distant towns. Aristotle paused there on the hill, letting the sight settle into him. He felt the faint tremor of nervousness beneath his ribs, mixed with awe and a sense of profound possibility. This was the place where countless thinkers before him had discovered new ways of understanding the world. Now he had arrived to add his footsteps to theirs. Stepping into Athens felt like stepping into a current of thought. The agora, bustling with merchants, artisans, and speakers, pulsed with voices that blended into a hum of ideas. People argued passionately about politics, exchanged philosophical quips with strangers, recited poetry as though words themselves held magic. Aristotle moved through the crowd slowly, absorbing everything. The smells of baked bread and olive oil, the distant sound of a lyre, the rhythm of footsteps on stone. He saw men gathered beneath shaded porticos, discussing matters that stretched beyond daily life. Justice, virtue, the nature of the cosmos. It struck him deeply that here, questioning was not merely tolerated, but celebrated, that a young man could speak of abstract ideas without being dismissed. Athens felt alive not only with movement, but with thought. Yet beneath the excitement, Aristotle also felt the weight of his own smallness. He was just one young man among many, carrying only the curiosity that Stagira had cultivated in him. He had heard stories of Plato and his academy, of the brilliant minds who studied there, of the profound questions they pursued, and he wondered whether he could ever find a place among them. The thought brought both humility and determination. He knew that he did not come from a prominent city, that he lacked the wealth or connections that others might use to open doors. But he also carried something he believed might guide him: a patience for careful observation, a willingness to admit ignorance, and a desire to understand that felt deeper than any ambition. In the evenings after his arrival, Aristotle wandered the city in quiet reflection. He visited the outskirts where the air was cooler and the noise of the agora softened into a distant murmur. He watched the sunset cast long shadows across the hills, turning the stone buildings golden. He listened to the conversations of students seated beneath the trees, heard the faint laughter of youths training in the gymnasium, and felt the pulse of a city that lived not just through its people, but through its ideas. He sensed that Athens itself was a kind of living organism, breathing through debate, growing through disagreement, shaping its identity through the steady, relentless pursuit of truth. Though he had not yet stepped foot in the academy, Aristotle already felt its pull. He imagined the marble walkways, the quiet library of scrolls, the gardens where students and teachers strolled while exchanging thoughts. He imagined standing among them, learning not only from their lessons, but from the spaces between their questions. If Stagira had prepared the soil of his mind, Athens would be the place where seeds could take root. And so, on his first nights in the city, as he lay awake beneath a foreign sky, Aristotle felt the first stirrings of the life that waited him. Athens was not merely a destination, it was the beginning of a transformation. The boy who had once studied tide pools and watched insects in the fields had arrived in a world that would challenge him, shape him, and eventually elevate him into one of the most influential thinkers the world had ever known. His journey had ended, but his true beginning had just unfolded. Plato did not enter Aristotle's life with the force of thunder or the brilliance of revelation. Instead, he appeared the way true teachers often do, quietly, almost gently, stepping into the young man's world like a door opening to a room he had not known existed. The academy itself felt like a sanctuary of thought, surrounded by gardens where leaves whispered softly in the wind, and long porticos where footsteps echoed with the steady rhythm of inquiry. When Aristotle first walked through its gates, he felt as though he was stepping into a place that existed outside the ordinary flow of time. Students moved with a contemplative stillness, their voices low and thoughtful, as if aware that every word belonged to a conversation stretching far beyond their own lives. And at the center of this quiet storm of ideas stood Plato, tall, calm, his presence both gentle and precise. The kind of man who could soften a room simply by entering it. Aristotle, still young and unshaped by the philosophical weight he would one day carry, felt something shift within him the moment he saw Plato addressing a small group beneath the shade of an olive tree. It was not awe exactly, nor intimidation, but a profound awareness that he was standing in front of a man who had already travelled far along the path Aristotle longed to follow. The first time Aristotle heard Plato speak, the world around him seemed to slow. Plato's voice was calm, but carried a resonance that made even the simplest ideas feel luminous. He spoke not in the rigid structure of argument, but in the flowing cadence of someone inviting his listeners to accompany him on a journey of thought. He asked questions that seemed both obvious and impossibly deep. Questions about justice, about the nature of truth, about whether the world seen by the eyes was less real than the world grasped by the mind. Aristotle listened with a stillness that surprised even himself, for he felt each question not as a challenge, but as a beckoning, as if Plato were gently opening windows in his mind, letting in new light. It was the first time he had encountered someone whose curiosity matched his own, who understood that questioning was not a sign of ignorance, but the beginning of wisdom. Plato noticed the young man early, though Aristotle himself remained unaware of it. He noticed the way Aristotle leaned slightly forward when listening, as though trying to catch even the shadows of ideas. He noticed the quiet intensity of his gaze, the patience in his posture, the habit of letting a question linger in silence rather than rushing to fill it with an answer. Plato had seen many students come and go, some eager for argument, others hungry for recognition. But in Aristotle, he sensed something different, something steadier and more enduring. There was no arrogance in him, no performance of intellect, only a genuine hunger to understand. And so Plato, who had inherited Socrates' gentleness and his love of guiding minds toward clarity, began to draw Aristotle into the conversations that shaped the heart of the academy. Their first true dialogue took place not in a classroom, but during an evening walk along one of the academy's stone paths. The air was cool, carrying the faint scents of cypress and dust stirred by the day's activity. Plato walked with his hands loosely folded behind his back, Aristotle a respectful distance beside him, unsure whether he had the right to speak. But Plato, sensing the young man's hesitation, asked a simple question. "Tell me, what is it you hope to find here?" The question, though gentle, struck Aristotle with the weight of something far deeper than polite inquiry. He paused, gathering the words that had long remained silent inside him, and finally answered that he wished to understand the world, not in fragments, but as a whole, in its causes and purposes, in its movements and its stillness. Plato smiled softly at this, the kind of smile that acknowledges not only the answer, but the heart behind it, and replied that such understanding was a lifelong pursuit, one that required patience, humility, and a willingness to let go of certainty. The conversation continued as the evening deepened, and by the time the lamplighters passed through the academy to ignite the night's glow, Aristotle sensed that he had found not just a teacher, but a guide. Aristotle's early days under Plato's influence were marked by a blend of admiration and challenge. Plato's ideas were grand, reaching upward toward the realm of perfect forms, toward eternal truths untouched by the imperfections of the physical world. Aristotle, grounded by a childhood spent observing the tangible details of nature, felt both drawn to and troubled by these notions. He admired Plato's brilliance, the elegance of his thought, the poetic clarity with which he described the invisible architecture of reality. Yet he also felt a quiet resistance growing inside him, a sense that truth might not lie solely in abstraction, but also in the living, changing world. The plants that grew according to unseen patterns, the animals that behaved with instinctive purpose, the human beings whose choices reflected the complexity of their inner lives. But Aristotle did not voice this resistance yet. He understood instinctively that to challenge Plato, he must first understand him deeply, patiently, from the inside. In the years that followed, the relationship between the two men deepened into something that was neither simply mentorship nor friendship, but a delicate balance of both. Plato came to respect Aristotle's clarity of perception, his methodical approach to thought, his refusal to accept easy answers. Aristotle, in turn, came to appreciate the expansiveness of Plato's vision, the generosity with which he cultivated young minds, the gentleness that lingered behind even his sharpest arguments. Their conversations became a dance, a slow, thoughtful movement between ideas, each man stepping forward and back, offering insights that illuminated the other's path. Plato guided Aristotle toward questions of ethics, mathematics, and metaphysics, while Aristotle, quietly and without yet realizing it, began to sharpen the foundations of logic and empirical inquiry. There were moments, rare and fleeting, when Aristotle felt overwhelmed by the brilliance of the man before him, by the weight of the Academy's legacy, by the knowledge that he was walking in the shadow of minds that had shaped entire generations. But instead of discouraging him, this awareness settled into him like a solemn responsibility. He did not aspire to surpass Plato or to rival his achievements. He sought only to understand, to see clearly, to honor the questions that had carried him from the quiet shores of Stagira to the intellectual heart of Greece. Looking back years later, Aristotle would recognize this period as the turning point of his life. The moment when his mind began to take shape, not as a mirror of Plato's, but as something distinct, rooted in observation rather than abstraction, grounded in the belief that truth reveals itself, not only in the heavens, but also in the earth beneath one's feet. But for now, in these early days, he was simply a young student walking beside a great teacher, listening carefully, asking gently, learning to think not just with brilliance, but with humility. And thus, in the quiet mornings and long evenings of the Academy, the first transformation of Aristotle's life began. Not through thunder, not through revelation, but through the soft, steady guidance of a man who saw in him the potential to one day shape the world in ways neither of them could yet imagine. The years that followed settled over Aristotle like a long, gentle tide, an era not marked by dramatic events or grand declarations, but by the steady accumulation of thought, observation, and quiet discipline that would one day form the foundation of his life's work. Life in the Academy unfolded with a rhythm that was both structured and fluid. Mornings filled with lectures beneath shaded porticos, afternoons spent walking slowly through the gardens where students debated in clusters of 2 or 3, evenings given over to contemplation as oil lamps flickered against marble walls. For Aristotle, each day felt like a page in a book he was slowly learning to read, a book written not only in words, but in silences, in the measured pause between questions, in the patient unfolding of ideas that stretched far beyond the immediate moment. He learned early that the academy was not a place for quick conclusions. It was a place where thought itself was treated as a kind of sacred practice, where the mind was encouraged to wander, return, and wander again, exploring the terrain of knowledge with the care one gives to mapping unfamiliar land. Aristotle approached his studies with a devotion that was quiet but unmistakable. While some students sought to impress Plato with eloquent arguments or clever paradoxes, Aristotle concerned himself with understanding the deeper structure beneath each topic they explored. If they studied mathematics, he lingered not on the demonstrations themselves, but on the principles that made them possible. If they discussed ethics, he listened not only to the claims, but to the assumptions that lay beneath them, tracing each idea back to its roots with the same patience he once used to examine the movement of insects along the shores of Stagira. He filled wax tablets with careful notes, observations about the nature of change, the qualities of numbers, the patterns of logic as they appeared in speech and thought. These notes were not polished. They were the raw material of understanding, the early attempts of a mind learning not just to gather knowledge, but to shape it, organize it, and question it with increasing precision. The academy offered an intellectual landscape far broader than Aristotle had imagined. Students came from across Greece and beyond, each carrying with them traditions, questions, and experiences that enriched the conversations of the day. Some were fiery in debate, quick to challenge and quicker to defend their beliefs. Others, like Aristotle, studied more quietly, their contributions carrying a weight born not of volume, but of clarity. The diversity of voices created an atmosphere where ideas clashed and harmonized in equal measure, where disagreement was not a source of conflict, but a path toward refinement. In this setting, Aristotle learned to speak with both confidence and care, expressing his thoughts in a way that revealed their structure without overshadowing the thoughts of others. He discovered that philosophy was as much a communal craft as an individual pursuit, shaped by the shared commitment of students seeking truth with different tools, different backgrounds, and different temperaments. Yet even as he absorbed the teachings around him, Aristotle began to sense the beginnings of a quiet divergence between himself and the philosophical current that flowed through the academy. Plato's world was one of forms, eternal, perfect, unchanging realities that stood behind the shifting shadows of the physical world. It was a vision that inspired many, offering a sense of stability and purity that appealed to those weary of the chaos of human affairs. Aristotle admired the beauty of this vision, and he respected the clarity with which Plato presented it. But as the years passed, he found himself drawn increasingly toward the concrete, the observable, the living world that surrounded him each day. He spent long hours studying plants in the academy's gardens, tracing the structure of their leaves, observing how they responded to sunlight and water. He examined animals brought by travelers or kept in small enclosures, noting their movements, their instincts, the subtle differences that distinguished one species from another. He found himself thinking not in terms of abstract forms, but in terms of purpose, cause, function, a worldview rooted in the belief that to understand something, one must begin with what the senses reveal. Aristotle did not present these thoughts as challenges. He held them quietly within himself, nurturing them with the same care he gave to the observations he collected. He understood that he was still a student, still learning to articulate his thoughts, still gathering the pieces he would one day shape into a philosophy of his own. The academy, with its long corridors and shaded courtyards, became a kind of vessel for this internal development, a place where he could explore questions deeply without the pressure of reaching immediate answers. There were nights when he remained awake long after the lamps had grown dim, lying on a simple cot and listening to the soft sounds of the building around him. In those hours, he reflected on the day's discussions, letting the ideas settle and rearrange themselves in the quiet spaces of his mind. He did not rush this process. He trusted that understanding would emerge gradually, as naturally as seeds sprout in the earth with time and care. Despite his quiet nature, Aristotle formed strong bonds with several fellow students. Some admired him for the clarity of his thought. Others found comfort in his steadiness, his lack of pretension, the gentle way he treated every question as deserving of attention. Together, they walked through the groves, discussing everything from mathematics to politics to the behavior of animals. These friendships shaped him as deeply as Plato's teachings did, for they taught him that thought is not only a solitary pursuit, but a shared journey, enriched by the perspectives of those who walk alongside you. He listened to their stories, learned from their experiences, and, in return, offered insights that revealed his growing ability to synthesize ideas from different fields into coherent, fertile patterns. Through these years, Aristotle grew in ways that were not immediately visible. His posture remained modest. His voice rarely rose above conversation. His manner was unassuming. But within him, the architecture of a new way of thinking was slowly taking shape, built from the materials of observation, curiosity, and disciplined analysis. He was learning to see connections where others saw separation, to trace causes where others saw only events, to ask questions that reached beneath the surface of knowledge and touched its foundations. And so, the years passed, not in dramatic transformation, but in steady, faithful dedication. Aristotle entered the academy as a young man hungry for understanding, and in its quiet halls he found the beginnings of the intellectual nourishment he sought. But even then, beneath the calm surface of his studies, something deeper was forming, a philosophy rooted not in the heavens, but in the earth, not in ideal forms, but in living realities, not in abstraction, but in the unfolding complexity of the world itself. These were the years that shaped him, not through brilliance alone, but through patience, discipline, and the quiet conviction that truth reveals itself only to those willing to observe the world with humility and an open mind. The day Plato died did not arrive with a storm or any unnatural trembling of the earth. It came quietly, almost gently, as many endings do, slipping into the life of the academy like a soft gust of wind that extinguishes a lamp without warning. Word spread slowly at first, traveling from room to room in fragments of whispered phrases, until it gathered in the courtyards where students stood in still clusters, their faces turned slightly downward, as though listening for an echo they could not yet accept was gone. Aristotle heard the news not through an announcement or a public lament, but through the subdued footsteps of a fellow student approaching him in the garden. The shaking breath that preceded the words, the silence that followed them like a vast and empty field. Plato, teacher, mentor, guide, had breathed his last. And in that moment, as the quiet swallowed the space between them, Aristotle felt something inside him shift, not violently, but with a deep and sorrowful inevitability, like the slow settling of earth after a tremor. The academy, usually alive with conversation and gentle debate, fell into a reverent stillness. Students moved with a softness that mirrored the weight in their hearts, their voices muted, their gestures restrained, as though they feared disturbing the memory of the man who had shaped their days. The gardens, once filled with the sound of footsteps pacing through thought, now felt suspended in time. Even the birds perched in the olive trees seemed quieter, their calls softened into the warm air as though recognizing the gravity of the moment. Aristotle walked through these familiar spaces, porticos where he had once stood listening to Plato's lectures, shaded corners where he had debated with friends, quiet stretches of path where he had followed behind his teacher, now altered by absence. Each step he took carried with it the ache of realization. The voice that had guided him for years, the mind that had challenged and nurtured him, the presence that had illuminated his intellectual world, had vanished into silence. In the days that followed, Aristotle felt the loss settle into him like a second shadow, lingering just behind his thoughts. Plato had been more than a teacher. He had been a force, a steady beacon around which the academy shaped its identity. His vision of reality, ordered, luminous, intricate, had touched every part of Aristotle's early intellectual life. And now, standing in the quiet aftermath of his death, Aristotle found himself confronted with a question he had not anticipated. What does it mean to carry forward the legacy of someone whose ideas had shaped the very contours of your understanding? The sadness that enveloped the academy was not simply grief for a man, but grief for the certainty he had offered, the structure he had built, the unity he had provided to minds that were now suddenly drifting, unanchored in a widening sea of thought. Aristotle spent long hours alone in the days after the funeral, wandering the gardens where they had once walked together. He remembered the gentle cadence of Plato's voice, the soft laugh that punctuated his more playful arguments, the serene way he paused before answering difficult questions. These memories surfaced with a vividness that felt both comforting and painful, as though each recollection were a warm light touching a wound still too tender to bear. But beneath the surface of grief, something else was unfolding, a quiet, unspoken awareness that Plato's death marked more than the loss of a teacher. It was the end of an era, the closing of a chapter that had sheltered Aristotle as he grew, learned, and began shaping his own way of seeing the world. And though he did not speak of it aloud, Aristotle felt something else stirring within him, a small, steady resistance, a voice that had long been quiet out of respect for his teacher, now beginning to whisper with greater clarity. He had admired Plato deeply, but his own observations had led him along paths that diverged from the world of forms toward a philosophy rooted in the tangible, the observable, the changing. As long as Plato lived, Aristotle had held back, feeling no need to assert a difference that might appear as disrespect. But now, in the stillness following his death, Aristotle sensed that a new responsibility was forming. A responsibility not to echo Plato's ideas, but to honor the method of inquiry he had taught by pursuing truth wherever it led, even if that path branched away from the foundation Plato had laid. The academy, meanwhile, faced its own quiet fracture. With Plato gone, the question of succession weighed heavily upon the community. Speusippus, Plato's nephew, assumed leadership, bringing with him a style of thought that emphasized mysticism and numerical theories that felt distant from Aristotle's more empirical inclinations. Many students accepted the transition easily, comforted by continuity of lineage. But Aristotle felt an unease growing within him. Under Plato, the academy had been a place where questions deepened through dialogue, where ideas grew through shared examination. Under Speusippus, it began shifting toward a vision Aristotle did not recognize, one that emphasized esoteric speculation over grounded observation. He felt the subtle tightening of intellectual space, the narrowing of a world that had once felt expansive. This shift, combined with the weight of Plato's absence, made the academy feel less like a sanctuary and more like a room whose walls had quietly moved inward. Aristotle stayed for a time, honoring the memory of the place that had shaped him. But as the days passed, he felt the certainty of something he had long sensed, that his own path must now diverge from the institution that had nurtured him. Not out of bitterness, nor ambition, nor rebellion, but out of the simple truth that his questions were leading him elsewhere. Aristotle left Athens quietly. There were no grand farewells, no speeches marking his departure, only a small gathering of friends who stood with him at the gates of the academy as he prepared to go. They embraced him, some with tears, some with quiet resolve, each recognizing that the world was changing and that Aristotle's steps, though moving away from them, were part of the unfolding story they had all begun together. He did not look back as he walked down the road that led away from the academy. Instead, he let the memories of Plato's teachings settle gently into him, not as burdens, but as seeds. Seeds he would carry into the next chapter of his life, where they would grow into something distinctly his own. And so, the death of Plato, though wrapped in silence, became a quiet earthquake in Aristotle's life. It shook the ground beneath his feet, not with violence, but with the deep and subtle shift of a world rearranging itself. The man who had once been a student, sheltered by the vast canopy of his teacher's thought, now stepped into the wider world, not as a disciple seeking to imitate, but as a thinker preparing to explore, question, and build. Plato's voice faded from the air, but its echo lived on in Aristotle's heart, not as an instruction, but as an invitation to continue the journey in his own way, guided by the light of a truth that always asked for deeper understanding and gentler eyes. This was the silent earthquake that reshaped him, the loss of a teacher he loved, and the quiet dawn of the philosopher he was becoming. The years after Aristotle left the academy unfolded not as a single continuous journey, but as a series of quiet wanderings, each shaped by the slow rhythm of the Aegean Sea and the unspoken desire to understand the world through the patient study of its countless small details. He traveled first to Assos, a coastal town in Asia Minor, where the cliffs met the water with a calm that reminded him faintly of his childhood in Stagira, though the light here carried a different hue, and the mountains seemed to breathe a deeper, older silence. The journey across the water had been long, with days spent watching waves strike the hull of the ship in gentle, repetitive motions, and nights lying beneath a canopy of stars that stretched so widely it felt as though the heavens themselves had opened to watch him pass. During these quiet hours at sea, Aristotle found himself turning inward, reflecting not only on Plato's teachings, but on the growing conviction that the world could not be understood solely through abstraction. The sea, with its changing moods, shifting colors, and hidden depths, taught him more about motion and cause than any argument could. He realized that the physical world, in all its unpredictable variety, held answers for those willing to observe without haste. Assos greeted him with warm breezes, and the scent of salt mingled with the aroma of foreign herbs that grew along the rocky cliffs. The city was smaller than Athens, but its people were curious and its scholars welcoming. Aristotle was offered a place to stay and, in time, a role as a teacher. He accepted quietly, grateful not for the recognition, but for the stability it provided. A stability that allowed him to observe the world closely, patiently, with the same devotion he had once given to plants and tide pools in Stagira. In Assos, he spent long hours walking the coastline, studying marine life, sketching the forms of shells and fish, and contemplating the purpose behind each structure. The fishermen, amused by the philosopher who crouched near their nets, began offering him specimens that caught his attention. Strange crustaceans, fish with unusual patterns, unfamiliar creatures pulled from the deep. Aristotle accepted each gift with gratitude, examining them not with detachment, but with a kind of reverence, as though each living being offered a glimpse into the hidden logic of nature. His time in Assos also deepened his understanding of human society. The city, though peaceful, lay close to regions unsettled by political tension, and he witnessed how communities adapted to uncertainty with resilience and cooperation. He observed the relationships between families, the way elders guided the young, the subtle dynamics that shaped leadership in small towns. These observations, quiet and unassuming, planted the seeds of ideas about politics and ethics that would later shape his writings. Aristotle's philosophy was beginning to grow not from abstraction, but from the textured reality of human life, its struggles, its cycles, its hopes grounded in the ordinary rhythm of daily existence. When circumstances eventually drew him away from Assos, he traveled further across the Aegean, moving from island to island, staying for months at a time in places where the pace of life differed from everything he had known. In Mytilene, on the island of Lesbos, Aristotle found the landscape especially fertile for study. The island's lush hills and varied ecosystems offered him an opportunity to dive deeply into the natural sciences. He wandered through forests where sunlight filtered through layers of green, stood beside streams where water insects darted with astonishing precision, and climbed rocky heights where rare birds nested. It was here that his interest in biology blossomed fully. He dissected animals with care, noting the functions of organs, the proportions of limbs, the similarities and differences between species. His curiosity extended to plants as well, and he catalogued their structures, growth patterns, and the environments in which they thrived. These studies did not aim merely to classify. They sought to illuminate the purpose within each form, the order within each behavior, the interconnectedness that bound all living things to one another. During these years, Aristotle's days were unhurried and textured with quiet purpose. He taught small groups of students who gathered around him, not because of his reputation, but because of the gentle clarity with which he expressed his thoughts. They followed him on long walks through the countryside, listening as he spoke of causes, purposes, and the delicate balance that governed life. He encouraged them not to memorize, but to notice, to look closely at the world, to question their assumptions, to let observation guide their reasoning. His approach was different from Plato's, but it carried the same devotion to truth, expressed through a different lens. In these quiet lessons beneath open skies, Aristotle began to find his voice not as a disciple, but as a teacher whose methods reflected the world as he saw it, complex, dynamic, and endlessly intertwined. Despite the serenity of these years, Aristotle felt occasionally the faint tug of restlessness, a whisper reminding him that his path had not yet reached its full shape. He had learned much from these travels, far more than books or debates alone could offer, but he sensed that the time would come when he must return to the larger world, to a place where his ideas could be tested, challenged, and refined. For now, however, he let the Aegean cradle him in its gentle rhythm. He let the landscapes of the islands fill him with insights that would later form the backbone of his intellectual legacy. He let the simplicity of quiet days and long observations nurture the seeds of a philosophy grounded not in forms, but in living reality. Aristotle did not yet know that his wandering years were drawing him toward one of the most unusual and transformative chapters of his life. The invitation to teach a prince destined to become a king, a young mind whose future would shape the world. But these travels prepared him more deeply than he realized, not through grandeur or dramatic events, but through countless hours spent watching the movement of nature, listening to the quiet wisdom of ordinary people, and letting the world reveal itself with patience. These were the years in which Aristotle became himself, not through the echo of Plato's voice, but through the steady cadence of observation, reflection, and the gentle unfolding of a mind, learning to see the world in its full and intricate detail. And so he wandered, gathering knowledge the way others gathered stories, carrying within him the calm certainty that truth lived not in distant realms, but in the world beneath his feet, waiting for a thoughtful eye to notice. When the letter from Macedon finally reached Aristotle on the island of Lesbos, it arrived not with urgency or ceremony, but tucked quietly among other correspondence, carried by a messenger whose expression suggested he understood little of the significance behind the sealed scroll he delivered. Aristotle opened it beneath the shade of an olive tree overlooking the gentle rise and fall of the sea, expecting perhaps a request for scholarly advice or an invitation to lecture in a distant city. Instead, he found a summons that would alter the course of his life, and, though he could not yet know it, the course of history itself. Philip II, King of Macedon, sought a tutor for his 13-year-old son, a boy already known for his sharp mind, restless energy, and fierce hunger for greatness. The king wished for his heir not only to learn the arts of war and governance, but to be shaped by a philosopher who could instill in him the discipline of thought, the clarity of judgment, and the capacity to see beyond the immediate reach of power. And Philip, aware of Aristotle's reputation as both a thinker and a careful observer of the natural world, invited him to return to the land of his birth and take on the role of teacher to the prince who would one day inherit a kingdom. Aristotle read the letter slowly, letting the weight of each phrase sink into him like stones dropped into still water. He felt, at first, an unfamiliar hesitation. For years he had lived a life of quiet study, wandering from place to place, following the rhythms of nature rather than the demands of politics or royalty. His days had been shaped not by courts or princes, but by the patterns of birds in flight, the structure of plants, the behavior of fish moving through clear water. The simplicity of those years, the calm mornings spent writing, the long afternoons walking with students through open landscapes, felt worlds away from the sharp angles of royal life. Yet beneath the hesitation, another feeling stirred, a sense of responsibility, perhaps even purpose, rising gently through him. Philip's invitation was not merely a request for instruction, it was a call to guide a young mind that would one day wield immense influence. To shape such a mind meant shaping the future itself in ways both subtle and profound. He closed the scroll, lifted his gaze toward the sea, and let the wind move through his hair as he considered what accepting the invitation would mean. He thought of the boy he had never met, Alexander, whose name was already spoken with curiosity and caution by those who moved through Macedon's political circles. Rumors described him as bright but impulsive, passionate but untamed, fiercely ambitious, yet deeply sensitive to honor and loyalty. Aristotle wondered what kind of teacher such a child needed. Not a stern disciplinarian, he suspected, nor a flattering court poet, but someone who could offer structure without smothering spirit, guidance without imposing dogma. Someone who could reveal the world not only as it was, but as it might be understood. Slowly, almost reluctantly, he felt himself leaning toward acceptance, drawn by the quiet intuition that his wandering years had been preparing him for something larger than he had realized. And so, Aristotle began the journey north. The road to Macedon carried him through landscapes that felt both familiar and distant. Rolling hills dotted with shepherds, quiet villages where children paused their games to watch travelers pass, stretches of wilderness where the sound of his footsteps mingled with the rustle of wind through tall grasses. As he traveled, he found himself thinking not only of the task ahead, but of the path that had led him here. He remembered the calm logic of Plato's teachings, the gentle order of life in the academy, the silence that followed Plato's death, the freedom of wandering through the Aegean with nothing but a tablet and his curiosity. Each stage of his life had shaped him with a different kind of wisdom. The philosophical rigor of Athens, the empirical attentiveness of Lesbos, the resilience learned through grief and change. These layers of experience felt now like tools he carried within him, tools he might one day place gently into the hands of a young prince. When he finally reached the borders of Macedon, the air felt different, heavier, scented with pine forests and distant mountains. The people spoke with a stronger accent, their movements brisker, their faces shaped by lives lived closer to war than philosophy. Macedon was a rising power, ambitious and restless, a kingdom with its eyes on expansion. Its king ruled with both force and strategy, and its soldiers drilled constantly in preparation for conflicts that seemed always on the horizon. Aristotle sensed immediately that this was not the gentle intellectual world of Athens or the quiet pastoral life of Lesbos. It was a place defined by purpose, by momentum, by the pressure of being poised on the edge of transformation. Philip welcomed him with the politeness reserved for scholars, though his manner carried the weight of a man who rarely lingered on formalities. He spoke quickly, directly, outlining his hopes for his son, that Alexander might grow not only into a strong ruler, but into a wise one, that he might learn restraint to temper ambition, perspective to govern desire, and clarity to balance the demands of leadership. As Philip spoke, Aristotle listened with the calm focus of someone accustomed to reading, not only words, but tone, not only gestures, but intention. Behind the king's speech, he sensed both a father's concern and a strategist's calculation. Philip wanted a son capable of greatness, but he feared the fire that burned within the boy might consume him if left unguided. When Aristotle asked where the prince was, Philip gestured toward the palace courtyard. And there, training with a wooden spear, covered in dust and sweat, stood Alexander, lean, alert, his movements shaped by discipline, but driven by something deeper, sharper, more restless. Aristotle watched him for a moment before being noticed. The boy paused, his eyes narrowing with a mixture of curiosity and defiance as he studied the stranger before him. For a brief moment their gazes held, and Aristotle felt something he had not expected. An unspoken recognition, a faint but unmistakable sense that their lives would be intertwined in ways neither could yet understand. This first meeting did not involve profound words or symbolic gestures. It was simple, almost understated. Philip introduced them. Alexander nodded with the guarded respect of a child accustomed to power. Aristotle bowed slightly, acknowledging both the prince and the responsibility he now carried. Yet beneath the surface, something intangible shifted. Aristotle sensed the intensity within Alexander, the quickness of mind, the hunger for understanding, the impatience that came from knowing he was meant for something larger than the present moment. And Alexander, though young, sensed something in Aristotle as well. Not fear of royalty, not flattery, but a steady clarity that seemed immune to the atmosphere of power surrounding the court. Their lessons would begin soon. Their lives would change each other. And the world, though unaware, was already being nudged along a new path. Aristotle had arrived in Macedon, unaware that this quiet step would lead him toward his most influential role, and unaware that the boy before him would carry his teachings into lands far beyond the reach of Greek sunlight. The first days of Aristotle's teaching did not unfold in the grand halls of the Macedonian palace, nor under the watchful eyes of courtiers. Instead, they took place in a quieter, more intimate setting, chosen deliberately by Aristotle. A small grove just beyond the palace walls, where the young Alexander could step away from the rigid formality of court life and experience learning without the weight of expectation pressing upon his shoulders. Here, among tall grasses swaying in the morning breeze and the distant hum of insects weaving their steady song through the air, Aristotle introduced the prince not to the complexities of politics or war, but to the gentle art of observation. He believed that before Alexander could learn to rule others, he must learn to notice the world, to understand how things grew, how they changed, how they existed in relation to one another. And so, their lessons began not with books or proclamations, but with quiet walks along the riverbank, moments spent examining the delicate structure of leaves, and long silences in which Aristotle allowed Alexander's curiosity to rise without prompting. At 13, Alexander was a blend of sharp intelligence and restless energy. His mind moved quickly, often leaping ahead of Aristotle's questions, eager to grasp not only the surface of an idea, but its deepest implications. Yet, he also carried a fire within him, a fierce hunger for greatness inherited from his father, a desire to step beyond the boundaries of boyhood and into the legacy waiting for him. Aristotle recognized this fire immediately. It glowed in the boy's posture, in the way his eyes narrowed when he encountered something he did not understand, in the impatience that flickered through him like wind through dry grass. But he also saw something else beneath the intensity, a longing to be guided, to be challenged, to be understood not as a prince, but as a mind capable of growth. And so Aristotle approached him, not with awe or deference, but with measured calmness, inviting him to step into a space where power held no meaning and only inquiry mattered. Their early conversations were simple, almost deceptively so. Aristotle asked Alexander what he noticed about the movement of the river, why some stones lay smooth beneath the water while others remained jagged along the shore. He asked him to consider why certain plants grew in clusters while others stood alone, why birds of different species nested at different heights. At first, Alexander resisted these questions, finding them too trivial, too ordinary for someone destined to become king. But Aristotle remained patient, allowing the boy to circle back to curiosity on his own terms. Gradually, Alexander began to see that these simple observations held deeper truths, that the natural world revealed patterns of purpose, structure, and adaptation that mirrored the dynamics of human society. In time, the prince found himself drawn into the rhythm of inquiry, the slow unfolding of understanding that came not through force, but through quiet attention. As the days passed, Aristotle introduced Alexander to the fundamental tools of thought: logic, categorization, and the careful weighing of evidence. He did not demand memorization or recitation. Instead, he encouraged the prince to reach his own conclusions, guiding him gently when his reasoning faltered. Alexander, accustomed to the physical discipline of combat training, found this discipline of the mind equally challenging. There were moments when he grew frustrated, moments when he pressed Aristotle for definitive answers, unwilling to sit in uncertainty. But Aristotle knew the value of patience, and each time he allowed Alexander's frustration to soften into reflection. It was in these moments, when the boy wrestled with ideas larger than himself, that Aristotle saw the beginnings of true growth. There were days when their lessons took the form of long discussions beneath the shade of an old plane tree. Aristotle would speak softly about ethics, virtue, and the importance of self-governance. He explained that ruling others required first ruling oneself, that a king who could not regulate his own impulses would always be enslaved by them. Alexander listened, at times with skepticism, at times with surprising depth. He understood strength, he understood ambition, but the concept of restraint felt foreign to him. Yet, as Aristotle spoke, he began to grasp that power without restraint could collapse upon itself, that the greatest victories were often the quiet ones, won within the boundaries of one's own character. Aristotle also introduced Alexander to literature, reading aloud passages from Homer's Iliad and Odyssey. The boy already admired Achilles, seeing in him the image of a warrior whose name would echo through time. But Aristotle guided him to notice the flaws within Achilles, the impatience, the pride, the destructive anger that shadowed his glory. He encouraged Alexander to look not only at the greatness of heroes, but at the costs of that greatness, at the consequences that followed unchecked passion. This approach did not diminish the boy's admiration for heroism. Instead, it deepened it, teaching him to see heroism not as a simple culmination of strength, but as a delicate balance between power and wisdom. Occasionally, Philip himself visited the lessons, observing from a distance with a mixture of pride and caution. He saw in Aristotle a calmness that contrasted sharply with the relentless energy of court life, and he sensed that the philosopher's influence on his son was already subtle but profound. Alexander, who often met his father's gaze with challenge, now carried a new layer of thoughtfulness, a habit of pausing before speaking, of considering a second path where once he might have chosen only the boldest. Philip recognized this as a sign that the lessons were taking root. Yet the early days were not free of tension. Alexander sometimes felt torn between the world Aristotle opened before him, a world of quiet contemplation, intellectual discipline, and understanding, and the world his father demanded of him, one defined by power, strategy, and the preparation for war. Aristotle understood this divide and did not try to erase it. Instead, he sought to bridge it, showing Alexander how thought and action could coexist, how wisdom could guide strength, how a ruler could be both decisive and reflective. As the weeks turned to months, a bond formed between them, not the bond of master and subordinate, nor that of court tutor and prince, but the bond of two minds meeting in a space where neither lineage nor destiny held sway. Aristotle began to see Alexander not as a child of royalty, but as a young soul standing at the threshold of possibility. And Alexander, despite the pride that often tempered his openness, began to admire the philosopher not for his learning alone, but for the clarity and steadiness with which he lived. These first lessons, simple as they appeared, became the foundation upon which everything else would later grow. They were seeds planted quietly in the fertile ground of a restless and ambitious mind, seeds that would one day bloom in ways Aristotle could scarcely imagine. For now, the two walked the soft paths along the river, their shadows stretching side by side in the late afternoon sun, a philosopher and a prince beginning a journey that would shape the world. And in the stillness of those early days, Aristotle understood something profound, that the boy before him was not only meant to become a king, but that he carried within him the potential to become a force the world had never seen. His task was not to tame that force, but to guide it, with patience, with wisdom, and with the gentle firmness that only true teaching can offer. Though the earliest lessons between Aristotle and Alexander began gently, almost tentatively, it was not long before their relationship shifted into something far more intricate. A quiet but persistent battle of minds, a delicate interplay between a philosopher who believed in the slow unfolding of understanding and a prince whose thoughts leapt ahead with the intensity of a spark catching dry tinder. Aristotle soon realized that teaching Alexander would require a different rhythm than teaching his other students. The boy possessed a mind that did not move in straight lines. It leapt, surged, veered suddenly toward new questions, and circled back to ideas with renewed force. There were days when Alexander listened with remarkable stillness, absorbing Aristotle's words as though they were pieces of a puzzle he had long been waiting to complete. And there were days when he challenged every sentence, pushing against the edges of reason with the reckless confidence of youth. Aristotle learned to navigate this shifting energy with patience, adjusting his approach the way a seasoned sailor adjusts to the changing temper of the sea. Alexander's curiosity burned intensely, but it was not the soft, contemplative curiosity of a philosopher. It was sharp, hungry, often fueled by an underlying restlessness that he himself did not fully understand. He wanted to know why some men commanded armies while others obeyed, why certain lands prospered while others fell into ruin, why courage rose in some hearts and withered in others. Aristotle recognized these questions as early signs of a mind drawn naturally toward leadership and conquest, a mind already reaching toward the vastness of the world. Yet he also saw the danger that lay in such ambition, the risk of acting without reflection, of letting passion outrun wisdom, of mistaking force for strength. And so, while he did not dampen Alexander's fire, he sought to redirect it, to give it structure, purpose, and clarity. Their lessons often began in the quiet hours of dawn, when the sky carried the cool blue of early light and the palace grounds were still empty of movement. Aristotle would arrive with scrolls tucked beneath his arm, works of poetry, fragments of philosophy, accounts of distant lands. Alexander would meet him with a wooden staff still warm from morning training, his breath not yet steady from exertion. The contrast between their worlds, one of disciplined thought, the other of disciplined action, was striking, yet it created a harmony neither fully understood at first. Aristotle would speak of ethics while Alexander rolled pebbles between his fingers, testing their weight. He would describe the logic of argument while the prince traced patterns in the dirt with the tip of his staff. Over time, Aristotle realized these gestures were not signs of distraction, but reflections of how Alexander thought. Through movement, through tension, through the physicality of the world. And so, he allowed motion to remain a part of their lessons, understanding that the mind of a future king did not grow in stillness alone. One of Aristotle's first goals was to teach Alexander the discipline of questioning, how to push past the surface of things without letting impulse distort understanding. He presented the prince with paradoxes, logical puzzles, ethical dilemmas designed not to confuse, but to refine. Alexander approached each challenge with an intensity that bordered on impatience, insisting on reaching a conclusion quickly, often through sheer force of will. Aristotle gently pushed back, reminding him that wisdom could not be seized like territory. It had to be invited, coaxed, cultivated through restraint. A man who forces an answer, Aristotle once told him during a particularly tense debate, teaches nothing to his own mind except how to break the doors it should learn to open. The boy had bristled at first, but hours later, as they walked beside the river, Alexander repeated the phrase to himself, tasting its truth in silence. Aristotle also sought to introduce Alexander to the idea that greatness was not built solely on strength or victory, but on understanding one's own nature. He observed the prince carefully, noting how quickly he grew bored when lessons felt abstract, how his attention sharpened when knowledge revealed something about human behavior or the mechanics of leadership. So Aristotle tailored his teachings to meet the boy where he stood. He taught him about the temperaments of different peoples, the structure of governments, the psychology of loyalty and fear. He used stories from history, not as simple tales, but as living examples, to show how rulers rose and fell, not just through skill in battle, but through their ability to govern themselves. Alexander listened to these lessons with fascination, though at times he resisted their implications. Self-restraint did not align easily with the fire in his spirit, yet Aristotle insisted gently that the greatest kings mastered themselves before mastering others. Despite the challenges, moments of profound connection began to emerge. Brief, shining intervals when teacher and student met at the same depth of thought. Sometimes it happened during discussions of ethics, when Alexander surprised Aristotle with insights that revealed a maturity beyond his years. Sometimes it happened when Aristotle introduced him to natural science, and the prince, to his own astonishment, found himself captivated by the structure of a bird's wing or the instinctive patterns of animal behavior. There were even rare instances when Alexander's fierce energy softened into something quieter, and he asked questions not of conquest or leadership, but of the nature of the soul, of the meaning of destiny, of whether greatness was chosen or inherited. In these moments, Aristotle glimpsed the young man who might one day balance ambition with wisdom, passion with clarity. Yet for all their harmony, their relationship was not without conflict. Alexander often pushed Aristotle to speak of power, of empire, of how a ruler might expand the reach of his kingdom. Aristotle, wary of feeding the boy's already blazing ambition, redirected the conversation toward responsibility, toward justice, toward the duties of a ruler whose actions shaped countless lives. Sometimes Alexander accepted this redirection. Other times he grew frustrated, accusing Aristotle of holding back knowledge that could sharpen his path to greatness. Aristotle bore these moments with quiet endurance, knowing that the prince's impatience was not hostility, but the natural consequence of a mind that felt caged by youth. As the seasons turned and their lessons deepened, Aristotle began to sense that the transformation he had hoped for was taking root within Alexander. The boy still burned fiercely, but the fire was learning to move with direction rather than chaos, to illuminate rather than consume. His judgments grew more nuanced, his temper cooled more quickly, his questions held greater depth. The gentle battle of minds continued, sometimes sharp, sometimes tender, always alive. But beneath it all, a mutual respect flourished, built not on authority or obligation, but on the recognition that each saw in the other something essential to his own becoming. Teacher and prince walked these years together, unaware of the magnitude of what they were shaping. Aristotle was training not simply a future king, but a young man whose footsteps would one day echo across continents. Alexander was absorbing not simply lessons, but the foundation of a worldview that would influence every campaign he led, every city he built, every life he touched. In this quiet crucible of thought and youth, the world was already beginning to change, softly, invisibly, with the steady patience of history at work. The lessons that changed Alexander most deeply were never delivered in formal settings, nor during long speeches in the palace courtyard. They unfolded instead during slow walks along the river, just beyond the city walls, a place where the noise of soldiers drilling, the tension of court politics, and the ceaseless demands of royal expectation seemed to dissolve into the soft murmur of flowing water. Aristotle chose this place with intention. He understood that the young prince, caught between his father's ambitions and his own restless hunger for greatness, needed not only knowledge, but space. Space to think, to question, to feel the contours of his own mind without the heavy armor of pride and duty. And so, morning after morning, they walked a narrow beaten path shaded by plane trees, whose roots reached toward the riverbank, like old hands pressing into the earth. Here, in this quiet corridor of nature, the seeds of Alexander's future leadership were planted with the patience of someone who knew that deep roots grow slowly, invisibly, long before they break the surface. Their walks rarely began with lectures. Aristotle allowed silence to linger, believing that thought required room to breathe. He waited for Alexander to speak first, to voice whatever question, frustration, or observation had settled in him overnight. Some mornings, the prince spoke of military tactics. He had seen his father's generals practicing in the training fields, maneuvers sharp and efficient, designed to overwhelm opponents with sheer force. Other mornings he spoke of tensions among the nobility, of whispered alliances forming behind closed doors, of the subtle but relentless power struggles that shaped life in the Macedonian court. Occasionally, he spoke of dreams, vivid, fevered visions that left him awake before dawn, heart racing with the strange certainty that he was meant for something more than the narrow world of palace corridors and strategy rooms. Aristotle listened with the quiet steadiness that had become a kind of refuge for the boy, responding not with certainty, but with questions that invited reflection rather than impulse. It was during these walks that Aristotle began introducing Alexander to ideas that would shape his understanding of leadership for the rest of his life. He spoke of how every living structure, whether a plant, an animal, or a city, functioned through balance, its survival depending on the harmony between its parts. He pointed to the river as an example, how it nourished the land when it flowed steadily, but caused destruction when it surged beyond its banks, how its power lay not in its force alone, but in the consistency of its movement. Alexander followed these metaphors attentively, sensing in them lessons about power and responsibility that extended far beyond the landscape around them. He learned that leadership was not merely the act of commanding, but the art of understanding the interconnectedness of things, the way people responded to justice or cruelty, the way armies moved not only with weapons but with morale, the way nations rose and fell on foundations much deeper than military might. Sometimes Aristotle guided Alexander toward observing the smallest details of their surroundings. The way a bird hovered before landing on a branch, the spiral pattern of a snail's shell, the instinctive behavior of ants carrying food toward their nest. At first, Alexander struggled to understand why these observations mattered to someone destined to rule territories far larger than the fields surrounding them. Yet slowly, subtly, he began to see that Aristotle was teaching him more than natural science. He was teaching him to recognize order, purpose, and the hidden principles that shaped every living system. The prince began to notice patterns on his own, connecting what he saw in nature to what he observed in human affairs. A flock of birds adjusting their formation in flight reminded him of soldiers repositioning on the battlefield. The competition between trees for sunlight mirrored the rivalry between nobles seeking influence in his father's court. These connections deepened his thinking, grounding his fierce ambition in an awareness of structure and consequence. As the months passed, Alexander's questions grew more complex. He asked about justice, whether it was the same for all men or shaped by circumstance. He asked whether a king should be feared or loved, whether the loyalty of soldiers came from devotion or necessity, whether greatness was achieved through destiny or deliberate choice. Aristotle responded with the same patient rigor he used in all things, guiding the prince through the layers of each question without imposing answers. He wanted Alexander to arrive at conclusions through clarity, not through obedience. Their discussions often lasted long after the sun had climbed high, the river shimmering with reflected light as they debated possibilities and outcomes. These were not the debates of a teacher lecturing a student, but of two minds testing one another, sharpening their ideas like blades drawn across stone. One morning, while they stood watching the river swell from recent rains, Aristotle spoke of moderation, not as weakness, but as the steady force that allowed strength to endure. He told Alexander that fire burned brightest when fed with care, but turned to ashes when left unchecked. The prince listened in silence, his gaze fixed on the churning water. He understood the metaphor, though accepting it was another matter. His nature resisted moderation. He felt most alive when pushing boundaries, when imagining futures broader than anyone else dared to conceive. But Aristotle's words stayed with him, echoing in his mind in moments of anger or ambition, tempering impulses that might otherwise have flared uncontrollably. This internal shift, though small and often unnoticed by others, marked the beginning of Alexander's developing discipline, an inner dialogue that balanced desire with reflection. Not all lessons during their river walks were philosophical. Aristotle also taught Alexander geography, pointing out how landscapes shaped cultures, how mountains created barriers that protected nations or isolated them, how the availability of water determined the rise of cities. He taught him the names of distant lands, Asia Minor, Persia, Egypt, and described the people who lived there, their customs, their strengths, their vulnerabilities. Alexander absorbed these lessons eagerly, his imagination stirred by the idea of lands beyond Macedon, lands that whispered of destiny and possibility. But Aristotle framed these lessons carefully, reminding the prince that knowing a place was not the same as conquering it, and that understanding people was far more important than defeating them. He planted within Alexander the idea that knowledge itself was a form of power, one that shaped empires more deeply than weapons ever could. As teacher and student walked the quiet paths, something profound and unspoken began to anchor itself between them: trust. Alexander, who rarely showed vulnerability in the court, allowed moments of uncertainty to surface during these walks. He spoke of the pressure he felt to meet his father's expectations, of the fear that he might fail, of the loneliness that came from being surrounded by people who admired his lineage, but not necessarily his heart. Aristotle accepted these confessions without judgment, offering him the sense of safety that allowed growth to take root. In return, Alexander offered Aristotle a glimpse of a mind both brilliant and volatile, a mind that, if shaped carefully, could reshape the world. And so, along the riverbank where water murmured over stone and the branches of plane trees rustled softly above them, the seeds of leadership were planted. They were planted not through command or proclamation, but through quiet observation, honest questioning, and the slow, steady cultivation of a mind awakening to its own power. Alexander did not yet know what he would become, nor did Aristotle know how far the boy's footsteps would eventually carry the teachings born in this quiet corner of Macedon. But history was already shifting, softly, invisibly, with every walk, every question, every moment of stillness shared beside the river. Life within the Macedonian court moved with a rhythm entirely unlike the quiet, steady cadence of Aristotle's lessons by the river. Here, ambition pulsed beneath every spoken word, and the halls carried not only the footsteps of servants and soldiers, but the layered whispers of those whose futures depended upon influence, loyalty, and the shifting mood of the king. From the moment Aristotle entered this world, he sensed the subtle tension that threaded through the palace like a taut string, a kind of unspoken vigilance shared by nobles whose expressions remained polite while their eyes betrayed restless calculation. Macedon was a kingdom rising toward power, but rising kingdoms are rarely peaceful. They are shaped by rivalry, expectation, and the silent fear that one misstep might unravel carefully woven alliances. Aristotle understood this dynamic instinctively, though he kept his observations to himself. He had come to teach Alexander, not to entangle himself in the affairs of those who circled the throne. Alexander, however, could not avoid the atmosphere that surrounded him. As the king's heir, he lived at the center of these shadows, touched daily by the weight of political intrigue even before he fully understood it. He noticed how nobles bowed deeply to him in open court, yet avoided meeting his eyes when they thought he was not watching. He noticed the sudden silences that fell when he entered certain rooms, the guarded smiles, the quick exchanges between men who had last week sworn their undying loyalty. And though he was still young, Alexander felt these things acutely. They stirred in him both suspicion and curiosity, creating a restlessness that even Aristotle's lessons sometimes struggled to soothe. The boy sensed, without needing words, that the world around him was filled not only with opportunity, but with traps, subtle, patient traps set by those who hoped to shape his future for their own gain. Aristotle observed this growing awareness with both concern and understanding. He knew that a prince who lived in such an environment would inevitably learn to read faces as carefully as he read books, to weigh intentions as precisely as he weighed arguments. But he also knew that exposure to intrigue could harden the heart prematurely, shaping a young mind to see manipulation where none existed, or to wield power defensively before learning how to wield it wisely. And so, Aristotle approached this challenge with the same gentle method he used in all things. He offered Alexander perspective rather than warnings, clarity rather than suspicion, understanding rather than fear. He explained that power often attracted shadows, not because power was inherently corrupt, but because it cast light, light that revealed ambitions in others they had previously hidden even from themselves. The boy listened, but the lesson was not an easy one to absorb. Intrigue did not unfold like a logical argument. It shifted like weather, unpredictable, unsettling, difficult to pin down. As Alexander grew older, the political undercurrents around him deepened. King Philip, ever ambitious, expanded Macedon's influence through strategic marriages, alliances, and military campaigns. Each victory strengthened his position, but also heightened the urgency with which nobles sought to secure their own futures. Some tried to curry favor with Alexander, offering him subtle gifts or speaking to him with exaggerated respect, hoping to plant seeds of loyalty that might grow when he became king. Others treated him with cautious distance, fearing that showing too much interest might draw suspicion from Philip. A few, bolder or more foolish, whispered doubts about the king's decisions in the prince's presence, attempting to mold his thinking in ways that suited their own ambitions. Alexander, quick to sense insincerity, grew increasingly wary of these interactions. He learned to maintain a calm facade, to reveal nothing of what he felt, to move through the palace with a grace that belied the turmoil beneath. Aristotle noticed the change in him. The boy who had once greeted each lesson with unguarded eagerness now carried a tension in his posture, a readiness that did not belong to a child, but to someone who had already witnessed more of human ambition than most men did in a lifetime. To help him navigate this world, Aristotle incorporated new teachings into their routine. They spoke not only of philosophy and nature, but of human character, how to discern sincerity, how to detect flattery, how to recognize when affection was genuine or merely strategic. They discussed leaders of the past whose downfall stemmed not from enemies, but from misplaced trust among their own advisors. Aristotle did not wish to make Alexander distrustful, but he wanted him to see clearly, to understand that power was a terrain filled with both allies and hidden dangers. Some evenings, after their walks by the river, they would sit in the fading light and observe the palace from afar. They watched how messengers moved with urgency at certain times of day, how guards shifted more tense or more relaxed depending on the king's mood, how servants hurried or slowed depending on which nobles were present in the hallways. Aristotle encouraged Alexander to see the palace not as a fixed structure, but as a living organism responding to its own internal pressures. Understanding a kingdom, he once said softly, begins with understanding the invisible threads that hold it together and the threads that threaten to pull it apart. Alexander, who had long viewed the palace as both his home and his cage, began to see it differently, as a complex system, one he would one day need to manage rather than simply endure. Yet the greatest challenge for Aristotle during this time was helping Alexander maintain his inner balance. The prince's fiery nature reacted strongly to injustice, hypocrisy, and deceit. When he saw a noble praising Philip in public while speaking against him in private, Alexander seethed. When he witnessed generals boasting of loyalty while secretly maneuvering for greater power, he felt the urge to confront them. Aristotle cautioned him gently, reminding him that a leader must choose his battles wisely, and that time often revealed truths more effectively than confrontation. These conversations were tense at times, for Alexander's blood ran hot, and patience came to him only through great effort. But slowly, over months and seasons, the boy began to shape his impulses rather than be shaped by them. Still, the court's influence was impossible to suppress entirely. Alexander absorbed not only wisdom from Aristotle, but also the hard lessons of royal life, the necessity of discernment, the power of silence, the art of appearing unaware even when fully alert. These lessons left an imprint on his developing character, adding layers of complexity to the boy who had once raced through training fields with unrestrained enthusiasm. Aristotle saw these changes with a mixture of pride and quiet sorrow. He knew they were necessary, but he also recognized the cost, the erosion of innocence, the formation of a mind that could no longer see the world without analyzing the intentions behind every gesture. And yet, through all this, the bond between teacher and student deepened. Alexander began to turn to Aristotle, not only for knowledge, but for grounding, for the sense of clarity that came from stepping outside the palace's charged atmosphere. Their walks by the river became a refuge, not from responsibility, but from the shadows that trailed the path of power. In these moments, Alexander could breathe freely, speak openly, and feel the strength of a mind shaped not by intrigue, but by understanding. Thus, in the midst of the palace's shifting alliances and unspoken tensions, Aristotle continued planting seeds of leadership within Alexander. Not through warnings or condemnation, but through gentle insight, through patient conversation, through the steady reminder that greatness required not only ambition, but discernment, not only strength, but wisdom. And in this quiet crucible of power and uncertainty, the young prince learned to see the world not only as it appeared, but as it truly was. There came a time, as Alexander moved from boyhood into the sharp-edged outline of a young man, when Aristotle began to feel a new heaviness settle quietly over his days. A weight that did not come from age, nor from the years of wandering behind him, but from the growing awareness of what it meant to shape the mind of someone whose footsteps would one day press deeply into the world. At first, teaching Alexander had felt like guiding a river into clearer channels, helping its waters move more steadily, more purposefully, without trying to change its nature. But as the prince grew older and his talents sharpened into something unmistakable, Aristotle began to see that this river was no ordinary stream flowing into nearby fields. It was a force already searching for distant shores, a current that would carve new paths through lands neither of them had yet seen. That realization brought with it a quiet, persistent anxiety. For a philosopher, error in thought might mislead a few. For a king, error could mislead nations. And so Aristotle, who had once delighted simply in nourishing Alexander's curiosity, now found himself lying awake at night, listening to the stillness of Macedonian air, and wondering whether the ideas he had planted would grow into shade or shelter, into healing or harm. He saw in Alexander a brightness that could not be denied, a quickness of mind that grasped complexity with startling ease, a bravery that did not shrink from difficulty, a sense of purpose that burned too steadily to be dismissed as youthful fantasy. There were moments, watching the prince argue a point with clarity beyond his years, when Aristotle felt something like awe, a recognition that he was standing beside a mind that might carry his teachings further than he himself ever could. But alongside this brightness lived a shadow, a fierceness that bordered on impatience, a pride that recoiled from humiliation, a hunger for greatness that did not always listen to caution. Aristotle had worked to temper these traits, to teach Alexander that victory without measure left ruins in its wake, that the soul of a ruler mattered as much as the lands he ruled. Yet he knew that no teacher, however patient, could fully shape the inner storm of another person. He could offer tools, not guarantees, guidance, not destiny. The realization that his influence had limits, even as its consequences expanded, brought him a deep, almost painful humility. In quiet moments, Aristotle found himself revisiting the path that had led him here. He thought of his own teacher, Plato, and the world of forms that had once felt like a distant, shining architecture behind reality. He remembered the way Plato had trusted him to think for himself, even when his thoughts began to wander down roads that veered away from the Academy's central vision. Had Plato, he wondered, ever felt the same anxious tenderness he now felt toward Alexander? The same mixture of hope and fear that comes from watching a younger mind grow strong enough to walk in directions the teacher cannot fully predict or control. Aristotle realized that teaching was not merely the transfer of knowledge. It was a kind of quiet gamble with the future, a willingness to place one's deepest convictions into the hands of another, and accept that they might be carried into situations one could never foresee. With Alexander, that gamble felt magnified 100-fold. This was no anonymous student who might one day teach a small circle in a quiet corner of Greece. This was a future king whose decisions would ripple outward across continents, touching lives Aristotle would never meet, shaping histories not yet written. He became more careful in the way he spoke, not cautious out of fear of displeasing Alexander, but deliberate out of awareness that every phrase might sink deeper than it seemed, lodging itself in the prince's memory to be recalled years later at a moment of crisis. When they discussed courage, Aristotle weighed his words so as not to glorify recklessness. When they spoke of glory, he pressed the idea that true honor lay not only in conquest, but in the way a ruler treated the defeated, the vulnerable, the unseen. When Alexander asked about the nature of greatness, Aristotle did not give him the satisfying certainty he sometimes craved. Instead, he led him through questions about purpose, consequence, and the fragile thread that ties power to justice. These conversations took longer than simple answers would have. They left Alexander restless at times, unsatisfied in the immediate moment. But Aristotle accepted this restlessness as necessary. Easy answers, he knew, could harden into dangerous convictions in the heart of someone who would one day command armies. There were days when Aristotle watched Alexander during military training and felt worry rise in him like a slow, cool tide. He saw how the soldiers responded to the prince's presence, how their gestures held a touch more fervor when he observed them, how their loyalty gravitated toward him, not simply because of his birth, but because of the intensity that radiated from him when he spoke. The men believed he would one day lead them into battles beyond Macedon's borders. They believed, even before Alexander did fully, that he was destined to carve a larger world out of the one they knew. Aristotle understood the intoxicating pull of such belief. He had seen how people, once convinced they stood beside greatness, were willing to follow it into storms even wisdom might avoid. He feared what might happen if Alexander's inner discipline ever lagged behind the devotion of those around him. If the boy, turned man, found himself surrounded by acclaim louder than the quiet voice of conscience. In the evenings, as the light faded and the palace settled into its layered patterns of activity and hush, Aristotle sometimes stood at a small window or walked alone along the edges of the gardens, letting the shadows lengthen around him while his thoughts turned inward. He asked himself whether he had emphasized enough the importance of restraint, whether he had given Alexander sufficient examples of rulers undone not by their enemies, but by themselves. He revisited their early lessons by the river in his mind, looking for omissions, for moments where he might have pressed deeper, stayed longer, insisted on more reflection. Yet, he also knew that a mind like Alexander's could not be shaped only by caution. Too much emphasis on limitation, and he might have stifled the very daring that could, if guided well, be turned towards something unexpectedly noble, a reimagining of how power could be used, of how cultures could meet under the banner of something more enduring than conquest alone. What troubled Aristotle most was the simple fact that he could not stay by Alexander's side forever. The boy would become a man, the prince would become a king, and the world would call him into arenas where no teacher could accompany him. There would be nights when Alexander would stand in a foreign camp on the edge of battle, surrounded by advisors whose voices did not carry the same patient cadence as Aristotle's. There would be days when decisions had to be made in the span of a heartbeat, when old lessons would have to rise unbidden from the depths of memory to help him see beyond the shimmer of immediate victory. Aristotle could only hope that when those moments came, the prince would not remember his teacher's words as constraints, but as quiet guides, like stars glimpsed briefly between moving clouds. And yet, beneath the worry, Aristotle also felt a softer, quieter trust. He had seen Alexander listen when it truly mattered, had seen flashes of compassion beneath the armor of pride, had noticed the way the prince's gaze softened when they spoke of the suffering caused by unjust rulers. He had watched him grow from a boy quick to anger into a young man who, though still fierce, sometimes paused before letting his temper speak. These changes were not complete, nor were they always visible to those who saw Alexander only in the bright glare of public moments. But Aristotle had learned to notice the small, understated signs of growth that often reveal more than dramatic transformations. In those signs, he allowed himself a cautious hope that the seeds he had planted would not be washed away by the flood of power, but would take root somewhere deep within the soil of Alexander's character. So the teacher moved through these final seasons of instruction with a heart both heavy and strangely grateful. He knew his influence was limited, yet real. He knew his worries might never fully fade, yet they spoke of a responsibility he did not regret carrying. To shape the mind of a future king was to live with the knowledge that your words might one day walk across distant fields clad in armor, that your ideas might stand silently beside someone as he weighed the fate of cities. It was a burden, yes, but it was also, in its own quiet way, a profound honor. And so Aristotle continued to teach, one conversation at a time, one walk at a time, one carefully chosen word after another, knowing that his part in Alexander's story would one day end, but believing, softly, imperfectly, and with all the humility he could muster, that something of his guidance might remain like a gentle echo in the choices the young man would make long after the teacher's voice had fallen silent. The day Alexander left for the life that would soon thunder across continents did not arrive with drums or proclamations, but with a quiet inevitability that Aristotle had sensed long before the palace walls themselves began to whisper of change. It was the kind of moment that does not happen all at once, but gathers slowly, like the tightening of a bowstring over months and years, until the final pull becomes simply the natural continuation of everything that came before. Alexander had been growing away from the sheltered paths of youth for some time, each lesson taken with deeper urgency, each question asked with sharper intent, each restless stare toward the horizon revealing more clearly the shape of the man he was becoming. And when Philip was assassinated, and the kingdom erupted with both grief and opportunity, the transition that had long hovered at the edge of their shared days finally solidified into a single, irrevocable step. Alexander became king. The student, whose mind Aristotle had guided with patience and tenderness, now stood alone at the helm of a world trembling with expectation. Aristotle watched those first days with a mixture of awe and ache. He saw Alexander moving through the palace with a steadiness that belied the turmoil beneath the surface, accepting oaths from soldiers, settling disputes among nobles, asserting authority with a composure that startled even those who had doubted him. Yet beneath that composure lay a fire, controlled but unmistakably fierce. The years of tension with Philip, the lessons whispered by riverbanks, the hours spent sharpening both intellect and instinct, all converged into this moment. Alexander did not step into kingship hesitantly. He stepped into it like someone who had been rehearsing the role in his heart for years. And Aristotle, though proud, felt the first blush of grief, knowing that his influence would now become a quiet echo rather than a daily presence. Their final conversations before Alexander's departure for the campaigns that would soon define him were not filled with speeches or heavy declarations. Instead, they held the softness of two lives that had grown together in ways neither fully understood until they began to part. In one such moment, they stood facing the familiar river, its early morning mist lifting in slow spirals from the surface. Alexander no longer looked like the boy who had once thrown pebbles into its current. His shoulders were broader, his posture straighter, his eyes carrying the distant brightness of a man already stepping beyond the world he knew. Aristotle waited for him to speak, as he always had, allowing the silence to settle gently between them like dew on the grass. When Alexander finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of responsibility that had settled on him in the days following his father's death. He asked Aristotle not for strategies or predictions, but for reassurance that he was ready, that the thoughts shaped in quiet study could withstand the noise of power, that the lessons planted in childhood would not be swallowed by the urgency of ruling. Aristotle, hearing the tremor beneath the steady tone, felt a tenderness rise in his chest, the kind that all teachers feel when they realize their student has grown into someone whose path can no longer run beside their own. He answered not with certainty, for certainty would have been dishonest, but with trust in Alexander's ability to remember the heart of what he had learned, even when the world pressed him toward other temptations. He reminded Alexander that wisdom was not a single moment of clarity, but a habit, a way of seeing, a willingness to return again and again to reflection, even in the midst of chaos. There were other conversations too, quieter still, marked by glances more than words. Alexander, for all his pride and confidence, struggled with the knowledge that stepping into his destiny meant stepping away from the one man who had ever spoken to him without fear, without calculation, without the weight of politics shaping every syllable. And Aristotle, though accustomed to guiding others through transitions, found that this parting touched him more deeply than he had expected. He had known from the start that Alexander was never meant to stay near the Lyceum or to follow the gentle path of philosophers. His student had always carried within him the momentum of something larger. Yet knowing this did not soften the ache of the moment. To teach is to love quietly, and to let go is the final, most difficult lesson. When Alexander departed with his army, the morning sky was pale and cool, carrying the metallic scent of anticipation. Soldiers lined the road, their armor catching the early light. Horses stamped impatiently against the earth. Advisors murmured instructions and cautions. Yet Alexander, mounted on Bucephalus, looked back only once, just a brief turn of the head, a gesture so small it might have gone unnoticed by anyone not searching for it. But Aristotle saw it, and in that glance lay everything that did not need to be spoken. Gratitude, affection, memory, longing, and the thin but unbreakable thread that would forever bind teacher to student across the widening distance of their lives. The years that followed would bring Alexander triumphs and tragedies on a scale neither could fully imagine. He would sweep across Asia with breathtaking speed, founding cities, defeating empires, becoming a legend even as he lived. Aristotle, hearing fragmented reports carried back to Greece, would listen with a mixture of pride and dread, recognizing in each victory a reflection of the mind he had helped shape. and in each act of brutality a shadow he could not fully prevent. Such is the pain of influence. To know that your lessons travel with someone into places you cannot enter. To know they will be remembered sometimes clearly, sometimes dimly, and sometimes not at all. Yet, for all the uncertainty that lay ahead, one truth remained steady in Aristotle's mind as he watched the dust rise behind the departing army. He had given Alexander what he could. He had offered him not only logic, ethics, and natural philosophy, but the steady presence of someone who saw him not as destiny incarnate, but as a human soul capable of choice. He had tried, with every conversation, to plant resilience where pride might grow too quickly, compassion where ambition might burn too hot, clarity where anger might distort judgment. And now the student had left the nest. The teacher, heart full and heavy, stepped quietly back into the life that awaited him. A life no less meaningful for its lack of armies, yet forever changed by the young man who had walked beside him through the formative corridors of youth. When Aristotle returned to Athens after his years in Macedon, he did so not as the wandering student of earlier days, nor as the quiet observer travelling between islands, but as a man carrying the invisible weight of a long journey, of responsibilities taken, influences accepted, and a chapter of life that had closed with both pride and a lingering ache. Athens, with its familiar streets and sun-washed stones, welcomed him, and yet felt subtly altered, as all places do when one returns older, bearing more of the world inside him. He walked through the city with the slow, reflective steps of someone reacquainting himself with an old friend, noticing the rhythm of the agora, the murmurs of merchants, the flicker of students reciting philosophy beneath shaded colonnades. It was a city shaped by memory and expectation, by the past he had once shared with Plato, and by the future he now felt compelled to carve on his own terms. The academy, though still active, no longer belonged to him in spirit. Plato was gone, and with his passing, the institution had taken a direction that did not echo the form Aristotle had carried quietly within him. The emphasis on abstract forms and metaphysical ideals had become more rigid, more insistent, as though the school were holding tighter to doctrine in proportion to the loss of its founder. Aristotle felt this shift not with resentment, but with a soft melancholy, understanding that he had grown in a different direction, one shaped by the riverbanks of Macedon, by the living textures of nature, by the practical complexities of teaching a future king. He needed space not only to think, but to breathe. He needed a place that mirrored the world as he saw it now, dynamic, observable, filled with questions rooted not only in theory, but in motion, experience, and the patterns of life itself. Thus, he began to imagine a school not enclosed by the high walls of contemplation alone, but open to the world, literally open, with pathways for walking, places for observing, and an atmosphere where knowledge unfolded not in rigid lines, but in meandering ones. This imagining soon crystallized into the Lyceum. He chose a quiet area near the temple of Apollo Lycaeus, just beyond the bustle of central Athens. The land was not pristine. Patches of wild growth mingled with old paths, and the air carried the earthy scent of soil turned by time. But it possessed a sense of openness that appealed to Aristotle. It was a place where the wind could move freely, where students could wander in thought without feeling confined, where the natural world existed close enough to be studied with the eye, the ear, the careful hand. And so he began his work, arranging spaces for lectures, gathering scrolls, inviting students who were curious, dedicated, and willing to learn through observation rather than proclamation. From the beginning, the Lyceum did not resemble other schools. It lacked the solemn sanctity of the academy or the polished authority of institutions aligned with civic power. Instead, it breathed with a kind of quiet movement. Aristotle encouraged his students to walk as they learned, believing that thought flowed more naturally when accompanied by gentle physical motion. The peripatetic style, as it later came to be called, grew not from affectation but from necessity. For Aristotle understood that understanding was not a place one arrived at, but a direction one moved toward with steady curiosity. Each day, students followed him along shaded pathways as he spoke not from a fixed podium, but from the living world around him, pointing to plants, insects, weather patterns, and human interactions as illustrations of deeper principles. The Lyceum became, in time, a sanctuary of gentle discipline, structured enough to cultivate rigor, open enough to invite wonder. The mornings were filled with lectures and discussions, but the afternoons belonged to quieter pursuits, collecting specimens, observing animal behavior, examining the structure of leaves or the patterns of stars emerging in the early evening sky. Aristotle moved among his students with soft authority, guiding their observations, asking questions whose answers were never simple, encouraging them to resist the temptation of quick conclusions. Knowledge, he insisted, was not merely the accumulation of information, but the cultivation of a mindset capable of seeing the world's subtle connections. Yet even as the Lyceum grew, Aristotle carried within him the distant echo of Alexander's footsteps marching across continents. Stories filtered back to Greece, stories of battles won with breathtaking strategy, cities rising at the edge of the known world, cultures meeting under the spreading influence of a young king whose name now echoed far beyond Macedon. Aristotle listened to these reports with a complex blend of pride and apprehension. He recognized his former student in the accounts of swift decisions and bold maneuvers, but he also recognized the shadows he had long feared, the edges of ambition sharpened by success, the weight of power pressing heavily on a spirit shaped by both brilliance and vulnerability. Yet Aristotle also knew that the path Alexander now walked lay far outside the philosopher's reach. The Lyceum became, in this way, both a refuge and a quiet answer to the ache of letting go, a space where Aristotle could pour his remaining years into the patient work of understanding, teaching, and observing. Within this tranquil sanctuary, his students found not only instruction, but a model of how to live a thoughtful life. Aristotle's days unfolded with a slow precision, waking at dawn, walking through the groves, speaking softly to those gathered around him, pausing at midday to write observations in careful script, and ending the evening outdoors whenever the sky allowed, watching constellations drift into visibility. He moved with a calmness that seemed impossible for someone whose mind held so many questions, yet this calmness was not the absence of thought, but the embodiment of it. Aristotle believed deeply that the act of inquiry was not meant to agitate the spirit, but to align it with the rhythms of nature. And so, the Lyceum grew, not through proclamation or ambition, but through the quiet magnetism of a place where knowledge felt alive, where questions were welcomed without haste, where the world itself became a teacher. Students arrived from distant regions to walk beside Aristotle, to observe his method, to witness the gentle interplay of wonder and discipline that shaped his approach to every subject. They found in him not a man living in the shadow of his famous student, but a thinker returning to his essence, embracing the simple, profound joy of asking, noticing, and understanding. By the time Athens began to whisper again of politics and rivalry, by the time the city shifted once more under the changing winds of history, the Lyceum had already become something enduring. It had become a home for the kind of learning that does not fade with the fashions of power, a place where generations would continue walking, thinking, and discovering long after Aristotle's own footsteps wandered beyond the shaded paths he had shaped with such gentle care. And as he settled into this new chapter of his life, Aristotle felt something he had not felt in many years, a quiet sense of belonging, as though he had finally found the landscape that matched the inner pace of his thought, a landscape in which learning unfolded not in sudden bursts, but in the slow, steady blossoming of the human mind. Life at the Lyceum settled into a rhythm that suited Aristotle in a way few chapters of his past ever had. A rhythm composed not of urgency or the expectations of kings, but of quiet accumulation, of observations gathered one by one like shells along a patient shoreline. Here, in this sanctuary of slow thought and wandering inquiry, Aristotle embraced a life that unfolded not through dramatic events, but through the steady unfolding of questions. His days filled with lists of animals and their habits, plants and their structures, stars and their movements, political systems and their fragile balances. To others, such lists might have seemed mundane, the work of a man cataloguing the ordinary. But to Aristotle, they were windows into the deep order of the world, the subtle architecture that shaped existence beneath the surface of appearances. Every detail mattered, from the curve of a bird's beak to the pattern of a city's laws. For each detail reflected something fundamental about nature's logic, about purpose and form, and the delicate harmony between them. In the early hours of the morning, when the air was still cool and the city's noise had not yet risen, Aristotle often walked the perimeter of the Lyceum gardens with a small tablet in hand. He paused frequently to examine a leaf's texture, the behavior of ants along a branch, or the way dew collected differently on various plants. These observations were not idle curiosities. They were pieces of a vast mosaic he was assembling slowly, patiently, believing that understanding the smallest phenomena illuminated the larger ones. He spoke often of nature as if it were a text written without letters, yet more precise than any human language. If one learned how to read it, he said, one could understand not only how things lived, but why they lived as they did. Students watching him sometimes wondered how such attention to tiny details could lead to insights about ethics or politics or metaphysics. But Aristotle understood deeply that knowledge was a continuous thread, weaving through every aspect of existence. To pull at one thread was to feel the whole fabric shift. Inside the Lyceum study rooms, scrolls filled with diagrams, comparisons, and careful classifications lay scattered across long tables. Aristotle's handwriting, steady but dense, ran across them in thick waves of thought. Notes about the anatomy of fish, reflections on the organization of bees, lists comparing the constitutions of dozens of Greek city-states. His method was neither narrow nor detached. It was expansive, seeking the patterns that connected the living world to human society, the principles that shaped the flight of birds and the structure of governments alike. He wrote as someone engaged in a lifelong dialogue with reality itself, listening as much as analyzing, sensing that the universe responded to attentive minds with quiet revelations. Some afternoons, when the heat settled into the stones and the breeze dwindled to a whisper, Aristotle gathered his students beneath the shade of the colonnade to speak of the stars. He had spent countless nights observing them, mapping their courses, noting their relations, contemplating their influence on human existence. He believed the heavens reflected not divine whims, but orderly motion, each celestial body part of a grand choreography that inspired wonder without requiring superstition. As he spoke, his voice remained calm and measured, yet carried an undertone of reverence. The students, sitting cross-legged on the sun-warmed ground, listened not simply because he offered knowledge, but because he invited them to feel the world as layered, interconnected, and quietly profound. Yet Aristotle did not confine his inquiries to nature alone. He turned equal attention to human behavior, to the structures of power, to the fragile balance between individual desire and collective good. He collected constitutions from a staggering number of city-states, comparing their strengths and weaknesses, their successes and failings. He interviewed travelers, listened to disputes in the agora, observed how people made decisions in groups or yielded to persuasion. His writings on politics emerged from these observations, not theoretical constructs imposed on reality, but reflections distilled from the living patterns he encountered daily. He believed that a good society could not be built on ideals alone. It required understanding the tendencies of human nature, its virtues and weaknesses, its passions and fears. For Aristotle, philosophy was not something separate from life. It was a mirror that allowed life to see itself more clearly. Evenings at the Lyceum were among his most contemplative hours. After the students dispersed and the gardens fell quiet, Aristotle remained outdoors, watching the sky move slowly toward twilight. He often traced constellations with his finger, whispering their names as though greeting old companions. He thought of the journey that had brought him here, from Stagira to Athens, from Plato's Academy to the Aegean Islands, from Macedon's palace to this gentle grove. He thought of Alexander too, picturing him far away amid dust and battle, carrying the weight of an empire with a determination that both startled and troubled the philosopher. News of Alexander's campaigns arrived intermittently at the Lyceum, sometimes depicting brilliance, sometimes brutality. Aristotle absorbed these accounts with a complex mixture of emotions: pride in the young man's unshakable courage, sorrow for the destruction that shadowed conquest, uncertainty about which seeds of his teachings had flourished and which had withered in the heat of ambition. Yet he did not allow these distant ripples of history to disturb the quiet purpose of his work. Each day at the Lyceum was a reaffirmation of the life he had chosen, a life dedicated not to power, but to understanding, not to fame, but to clarity, not to conquest, but to unveiling the patterns that governed existence. He felt, in a way he never had before, that his purpose aligned with the slow, gentle unfolding of truth. He was building something that would endure not through force, but through usefulness, not through spectacle, but through steadiness. The students who gathered around him absorbed this atmosphere deeply. Many arrived expecting rigid instruction or abstract debate, but found instead a teacher who encouraged them to look, to truly look, at the world, to ask questions without hurrying toward answers, to embrace the uncertainty that lay at the heart of all inquiry. They learned that lists were not merely records, but gateways to insight, that classification was not confinement, but clarity, that curiosity was not a childish impulse, but the beginning of wisdom. In Aristotle's presence, they felt not the pressure of intellectual competition, but the quiet invitation to expand their minds. Over time, the Lyceum became more than a school. It became a living archive of thought, a breathing space where knowledge entered gently, like light passing through leaves, illuminating without overwhelming. Aristotle, moving with his slow, thoughtful cadence through its shaded pathways, understood that this creation, this gathering of minds, this sanctuary of observation, might be his most lasting achievement. It held within it the essence of his philosophy, that truth begins with noticing, that understanding grows from patience, and that the world, in all its complexity, reveals itself most fully to those willing to approach it with humility. And so, his days unfolded, softly, steadily, filled with questions that rose like morning mist, and settled into the quiet certainty that learning was not a destination, but a lifelong motion. A motion he followed with a serenity born from knowing that even the smallest observation, the smallest list, the smallest question carried within it the possibility of illuminating the vast and intricate tapestry of existence. For many years, Athens had tolerated Aristotle with the polite distance reserved for outsiders who brought value without fully belonging. But tolerance is a fragile thing, easily shaken by fear, resentment, or the shifting winds of politics. As long as Alexander lived, rising from prince to conqueror, from conqueror to legend, the Athenians regarded Aristotle with a mixture of curiosity and caution. He was the teacher of the world's most formidable ruler, a man whose influence extended quietly through the corridors of power, though he never sought to display it. But influence, even in its gentlest form, casts a long shadow. And when Alexander died far from home, leaving an empire trembling on unstable foundations, that shadow suddenly grew darker in the eyes of Athens. The city felt vulnerable, exposed, and ready to turn its anxieties upon anyone who seemed too closely bound to Macedonian fortunes. Aristotle, who had never wielded a sword, now found himself treated as though he carried one. Whispers began first, soft, almost imperceptible, like the rustling of dry leaves across stone. Some Athenians muttered that Aristotle's connection to Alexander made him suspect, an intellectual bridge to a power they had both revered and resented. Others, fueled by lingering bitterness over Macedon's dominance, saw in him a convenient symbol of unwelcome influence, a reminder of years in which Athens had been forced to bow before a younger, fiercer world. These whispers, shapeless at first, hardened into rumors, and rumors, as always, into accusations. They claimed Aristotle favored Macedonian interests. They claimed he undermined Athenian traditions. They claimed that behind the calm order of the Lyceum lay intentions shaped not by philosophy, but by quiet loyalty to a foreign authority. None of this was true, yet truth mattered little in a city that had already chosen its target. Aristotle noticed the shift slowly, then all at once. He saw it in the way people stepped aside for him in the marketplace, not with respect, but with unease. He felt it in the tone of conversations that used to flow freely, now punctuated by cautious pauses whenever Macedon was mentioned. He heard it in the voices of students who confessed that their families were urging them to distance themselves from the Lyceum. The city he had once walked through as a quiet observer now felt charged with suspicion, as though every doorway watched him. Every corridor remembered something unspoken. For Aristotle, whose life had been dedicated to understanding the world through careful observation, this new atmosphere was its own painful lesson, one that revealed how quickly fear can cloud perception, how easily a community can turn against those who once enriched it. The death of Alexander intensified everything. Reports arrived in Athens describing the chaos that followed his passing. Generals carving territories for themselves, families competing for control, cities rising in revolt or sinking into uncertainty. These reports frightened the Athenians, who felt the tremors of distant instability as though they were tremors beneath their own feet. And when a city feels threatened, it reaches instinctively for something or someone to blame. The fact that Aristotle had shaped Alexander's early intellect, had guided his formative years, became a weapon in the hands of those eager to redirect fear into anger. They accused him of impiety, the same vague charge that had once doomed Socrates, a charge elastic enough to fit any emotion Athens wished to express. Aristotle felt the weight of history pressing upon him. He remembered the accounts of Socrates' final days, the way the city had moved from discomfort to hostility, from hostility to condemnation, from condemnation to death. He remembered how even the wisest man in Athens had been consumed by the city's inability to reconcile its ideals with its insecurities. And Aristotle, who had always believed reason could soften the hardest hearts, realized with a quiet ache that reason holds little sway over a mob wrapped in fear. The Lyceum remained a haven for him for a time, but even there the undercurrent of danger seeped in. Students glancing nervously toward the city, staff members whispering about new decrees, friends advising him to tread carefully. There were nights when Aristotle walked the shaded pathways of the Lyceum long after the students had gone, feeling the cool earth beneath his sandals and listening to the soft sigh of wind through the leaves. The gardens that once brought him clarity now carried a sense of fragile impermanence. He paused often, resting his hand on a tree trunk or tracing the curve of a flower petal, as though anchoring himself in small certainties while larger certainties dissolved around him. He had built this place slowly, lovingly, shaping it into a sanctuary for thought. But sanctuaries, he now understood, exist only as long as the world allows them. He felt the city withdrawing its permission. When the formal accusations arrived, delivered with official seals and the cold efficiency of bureaucratic hostility, Aristotle read them with steady hands. He did not feel fear so much as a deep, familiar disappointment, the disappointment of someone watching a beloved city repeat an old mistake. To stay and fight the charges would mean inviting the same fate Socrates had faced. To leave would mean acknowledging the city's rejection, accepting that Athens, in its current mood, could not distinguish between a philosopher and a threat. It was not a choice in the ordinary sense. It was a recognition of truth. Aristotle decided to leave Athens. He did so not out of cowardice, but out of principle. "I will not allow the city to sin twice against philosophy," he is said to have murmured. These words, soft, measured, but unyielding, carried the weight of both sorrow and clarity. He knew that reason had no place in a trial shaped by fear. He knew that Athens, wounded and defensive, was no longer a safe home for quiet inquiry. And so he prepared to depart for Chalcis, seeking refuge in a quieter place where hostility could not reach him as sharply. His final days in Athens were marked by a kind of gentle detachment. He walked the Lyceum grounds slowly, committing each detail to memory. The arching branches of the plane trees, the worn path where students had walked beside him, the echo of footsteps in the colonnade, the soft glow of twilight settling over the courtyard. Students gathered to say farewell, some with tears, others with the silent grief of those losing not a teacher but a compass. Aristotle comforted them with small smiles, reminding them that inquiry lived not in buildings but in the mind, that the Lyceum would continue as long as they carried its spirit forward. When he finally left the city, the road felt both heavy and strangely peaceful beneath his feet. Behind him lay the city that had shaped him, challenged him, welcomed him, and finally turned against him. Ahead lay exile, but also quiet, a quiet he hoped might shelter his remaining days. And as he walked away from Athens, Aristotle knew with painful clarity that the hostility of the city could not erase the years he had given to understanding the world. Hostility could silence a voice, perhaps, but not the ideas that voice had sent into motion. The philosopher stepped forward, leaving behind the echo of a city that had forgotten for a moment the gentleness of wisdom. Exile did not come to Aristotle as a dramatic tearing away, but as a slow, resigned step into a quieter world, a world that felt both smaller and strangely more spacious than the one he left behind. Chalcis, situated on the island of Euboea, lacked the intellectual energy of Athens, the political intensity of Macedon, and the radiant promise of the Lyceum. It was a place of simpler rhythms, fishing boats drifting across calm waters, the rustle of olive trees in warm breezes, the unhurried sound of footsteps on dusty roads. For a man who had spent his life immersed in cities shaped by ambition, rhetoric, and rivalry, this simpler landscape offered something unexpected, a final refuge in which thought could unfold without interruption, without accusation, without the weight of expectation pressing against every hour. Aristotle arrived not as the philosopher kingmaker of old reputation, nor as the founder of a great school, but as a quiet figure seeking space to breathe after a city he loved turned cold around him. The house he occupied in Chalcis was modest, with a small courtyard that caught afternoon light and a narrow view of the water. Aristotle moved through it with the slow deliberation of someone adjusting to solitude, touching the wooden beams, breathing in the scent of sea air mixed with old stone. He spent his first days walking the shoreline, feeling the gentle pull of the tide against his sandals, watching fishermen mend their nets with movements shaped by habit and necessity. There was something grounding about these scenes, something that reminded him of the fundamental continuity between all forms of life, between the disciplined order of a beehive, the structure of a polis, and the patient labor of men pulling boats onto shore. Exile stripped away the noise that had once surrounded him, leaving only the quiet pulse of existence, the persistent rhythm of being alive in a world that neither sought him nor feared him. Though his departure from Athens had been marked by disappointment, Aristotle did not spend his days in Chalcis consumed by bitterness. He had known from early youth that cities were as changeable as weather, that admiration and hostility often grew from the same soil. Instead, he allowed himself to enter a softer, more reflective chapter of life, one shaped not by teaching large groups, but by the gentler task of tending to his own thoughts. Scrolls filled with half-finished ideas, unanswered questions, and observations of animals and plants accompanied him into exile. He revisited them slowly, almost tenderly, as though each line held not only intellectual content, but memory. Memory of the Lyceum's colonnades, of students following him through shaded walks, of mornings filled with eager questions and evenings filled with the rising constellations he loved so deeply. At times, he found himself thinking of Alexander, not the figure described in reports that arrived from distant lands, not the unstoppable commander reshaping the world with iron and vision, but the young man who once stood beside a riverbank, struggling to understand patience, responsibility, and the meaning of greatness. Rumors of Alexander's death had reached Aristotle before he left Athens. But rumors are strange things, echoing with truth and distortion in equal measure. In Chalcis, the news hardened into certainty. Alexander was gone, leaving behind an empire fractured by ambition and mourning. Aristotle felt the loss not with the sharp pain of personal grief. Too many years had passed for that, but with a deep, quiet sorrow. He had once guided the boy's mind, seen the light and shadow intertwined within him, feared the magnitude of the destiny unfolding around him. Now that destiny had collapsed, leaving behind questions Aristotle could never answer. What had Alexander remembered of their lessons in the end? Which seeds had grown and which had withered? Did he ever feel the quiet voice of philosophy beneath the roar of conquest? Aristotle would never know. Yet he did not linger long on regret. Life, he believed, was not a line but a pattern, interwoven, cyclical, shaped by causes often invisible to the eye. He turned instead to the calm discipline that had always given him strength: observation. Exile freed him from the demands of public teaching, allowing him to return to the earliest joy of his youth, the simple act of studying the natural world without the pressure of guiding others. He watched the birds of Euboea, noting how their calls differed from those in Athens. He studied the sea creatures brought in by fishermen, fascinated by their forms, their adaptations, the subtle logic of their bodies. He catalogued plants growing along the rocky shoreline, observing how soil, shade, and breeze shaped their growth. In these quiet tasks, he felt a return to himself, a gentle homecoming to the boy who had once walked alone in Stagira, collecting insects while dreaming of the hidden order beneath the world's surface. But exile was not free of shadows. Aristotle's health, already fragile in his later years, began to falter. He felt fatigue settle into his limbs, and his breathing sometimes tightened in the warm, humid air. At night, when the world fell silent, he often lay awake listening to the distant sound of waves, aware that his life was nearing its narrowing end. The fear that had once visited him in moments of intellectual uncertainty now returned in a gentler form, a quiet wonder about what it meant to leave behind the world he had spent so much time trying to understand. He did not fear death in the way some men did. He feared only the incompleteness that accompanies all human endeavors, the awareness that there would always be more questions than answers, more mysteries than explanations. Yet this incompleteness did not trouble him as deeply as it might have earlier in life. The older Aristotle became, the more he accepted that no single mind could ever pass the entire structure of reality. What mattered was not the pursuit's completion, but the pursuit itself, the willingness to look closely, to ask patiently, to think honestly, even when certainty remained elusive. In this acceptance, he found a kind of peace, a softening of the restless rigor that had driven him through earlier decades. As the final months unfolded, Aristotle spent more time in his courtyard, sitting beneath the shifting patterns of sunlight filtering through the leaves. He wrote less, thought more. Sometimes he simply listened, to birds, to wind, to the distant hum of life continuing regardless of the dramas that once shaped kingdoms and cities. Exile, he realized, was not punishment. It was a final lesson in humility, in perspective, in the delicate balance between human ambition and the broader, quieter rhythms of nature. He died in Chalcis without spectacle, without crowds, without the intellectual fervor of Athens surrounding him. His passing was gentle, a slow dimming rather than an abrupt extinguishing. Those who knew him reflected on his final days as marked by calmness, thoughtfulness, and the same quiet curiosity that had shaped his entire journey. In the stillness of exile, Aristotle completed the last chapter of his life, not with triumph or tragedy, but with a serene return to the essence of who he had always been. A man who sought to understand, who walked slowly through the world, gathering wisdom the way one gathers light at dawn. And though he left the world far from the city that once celebrated him, he left it with a mind unclouded, a spirit unhurried, and a legacy that would soon outgrow every boundary he had ever known. In the years after Aristotle's quiet death in Chalcis, the world did not pause to honor him with grand monuments or processions. No armies lowered their spears in recognition. No cities changed their laws overnight. No temples thundered with proclamations of gratitude. His passing slipped into history with the same gentleness that had shaped his final days, subtle, unceremonious, like a small flame flickering out in a room where morning light was already beginning to gather. But legacies, Aristotle had always known, do not bloom in the noise of public mourning. They take root in quieter soil, in the minds that continue to think because of him, in the questions that remain alive long after the questioner has vanished, in the soft footsteps of ideas traveling farther than any warrior's march. And so, though the world did not immediately realize it, Aristotle's legacy had already begun its long and patient journey through centuries. His students at the Lyceum were among the first to feel the weight of his absence. They walked the familiar colonnades without the gentle rhythm of his voice, without the sound of his sandals brushing the dust of the pathways he had worn smooth over the years. Yet, as they gathered in small groups to discuss his teachings, they discovered something unexpected. Aristotle was still there, not as a presence hovering above them, not as an authority imposing itself upon their thoughts, but as a quiet undercurrent, guiding the structure of their reasoning, shaping the way they framed their arguments, reminding them, almost subconsciously, to look first at the world before deciding what it meant. Every list he had compiled, every classification he had attempted, every question he had sharpened into clarity became a tool they could carry into the future. And as they continued their work, the Lyceum remained alive with the gentle hum of inquiry he had set in motion. From Athens, Aristotle's writings travelled outward, first to other Greek cities, then to the scholars of Alexandria, where massive libraries would one day hold his treatises like seeds preserved for distant harvests. The men and women who read his words found themselves drawn not only to the content, but to the tone. The calm patience of someone who believed that truth was not a prize to be seized, but a landscape to be walked. They marveled at the breadth of his curiosity, how a single mind could hold within it the anatomy of sea creatures, the laws of motion, the structure of governments, the ethics of human behavior, the nature of the soul, and the movements of the stars. There was no disdain in his approach, no separation between what was considered lofty and what was considered low. To Aristotle, the world existed as a single woven tapestry, and every thread, no matter how seemingly insignificant, contributed to its pattern. Scholars across generations found comfort in this inclusiveness, this sense that knowledge did not belong only to the elite, but to anyone willing to observe. Centuries passed, and empires rose and fell, but Aristotle's ideas traveled quietly through each of them, like a persistent stream carving its path through stone. Medieval thinkers in distant lands, reading translations of his works in languages he never heard spoken, found within his logic a framework sturdy enough to build new philosophies upon. In the Islamic Golden Age, scholars studied his writings with reverence, calling him the first teacher, expanding upon his findings with insights of their own. In medieval Europe, long after Athens had lost its political brilliance, Aristotle's works resurfaced to help shape the intellectual revival that would eventually lead to universities, sciences, and systems of thought far beyond anything the philosopher himself had imagined. His ideas, once whispered beneath colonnades and carried in hand-copied scrolls, now shaped classrooms, laboratories, and libraries across continents. Yet perhaps the most enduring part of Aristotle's legacy was not his classifications or theories, many of which the passage of time would overturn or refine, but his method, his gentle insistence that understanding begins with paying attention. He taught the world that the smallest detail held meaning, that the movements of animals, the behavior of storms, the structure of language, and the patterns of human emotion were all doorways into deeper truth. Even those who disagreed with him philosophically inherited this principle of careful observation. Scientists, centuries later, men who mapped the skies with telescopes or dissected organisms under glass lenses, echoed Aristotle's quiet belief that the world gives answers to those who ask with patience. And what of Alexander, the student who had once walked at Aristotle's side? His shadow lingered over the centuries too, but in a very different way. Brilliant, violent, fleeting, like a torch blazing across darkness before burning out. His empire shattered soon after his death, leaving behind fragments rather than unity, memory rather than structure. Aristotle's legacy, by contrast, endured not because it conquered, but because it illuminated. One student had reshaped the world through force, the other through understanding. And history, with its long vision, eventually recognized that the philosopher, not the king, would offer the more lasting inheritance. In time, people began to see Aristotle not as the teacher of a single great ruler, but as a teacher of the world, a man whose footsteps in the groves of the Lyceum had left impressions that scholars, scientists, and thinkers would step into for thousands of years. His influence moved gently through time, never demanding recognition, never seeking triumph. Instead, it appeared in places where thought deepened, where curiosity awakened, where someone chose to observe instead of assume. His legacy lived in the way a student paused before reaching a conclusion, in the way a physician studied the structure of a body, in the way a statesman considered the purpose of a law. Near the end of this long arc of influence, when people spoke of Aristotle, they did so with a tone that resembled the very cadence of his life. Not loud, not dramatic, but calm, steady, reflective. They pictured him walking slowly beneath the trees, hands clasped behind his back, eyes attentive to everything around him. They pictured a man who believed in explanation rather than mystery, in observation rather than proclamation, in the quiet dignity of a mind that never ceased to ask why. And so, the story of Aristotle closes not with thunder, but with a whisper, with the soft truth that the gentlest footsteps can outlast the thundering hooves of armies, and that a life spent seeking understanding leaves behind a light that guides far more than a life spent seeking dominance. His legacy did not roar. It glowed, steadily, patiently, across centuries. Like the lantern of a teacher walking ahead on a dark path, illuminating not only his own way, but the way for all who follow.